pleases the committee.
You got my vote.
I think that gets a little complicated because again, the work on narration isn't attached to what we certified. I tell them I think we're going to get there with the 13. You have half a million working there now, and then you have.
Are we all supposed to be up here? Or?
You can. You can. I'm not going to talk about that issue. No, well, the intent was, so the intent, so I got all the numbers. So my intent is.
Manager. Manager's here, we could get started now. We're only 3 minutes behind schedule.
I sent that to me and I included it in my response.
I do. We may need 3. Yep. Thank-
We went through this last year too.
That's what I told Shannon. I said, let me just get 2 more. We'll get a motion and get you out of here. Okay, so I'm going to call to order the meeting of the Finance Committee. We are on day 4, I believe, of our budget hearings, but it is day 5 of our budget hearings. We're still on day 4 per the business we have to take care of our schedule. So can I have a roll call, please? Here. He's on his way. She's here. Okay, thank you. Our first item is our Public Utilities Department. And Mr. Jones. Oh, yes, I'm sorry. So we've got on today's agenda, yesterday's business, which was the Public Utilities Department, and then we will go into today's agenda, which is Planning and Land Use Department, Office of Affordable Housing, and Office of Economic Development. Is there a motion to approve the agenda? Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, motion carries. Okay, so that brings us to our Public Utilities Department. Mr. Jones, we have the your proposed budget. As I look at the summaries by category, Overall, your budget is down by 15.1%. There's a slight increase in salaries, wages, and benefits of 2.4%. Contractuals and utilities down 29.8%. Repairs and maintenance is down by 10%. Supplies down 12.4%. Insurance 2.7%. Other operating costs is up by 8.5%. Capital purchases down 5.7%. Debt service is up by 25.3%, and then transfers to other funds is down by 67%. So with that, Mr. Jones, if you can let us know about the decreases and why we're seeing those. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Yes, in the FY20 recommended budget from PUD, there is an overall decrease stated. It is stated as $12.3 million. Which a majority of that is made up by a couple of transfers that occurred last year, having to do with our digester project. As the project began to kick off, there was some money that was moved, about $8.6 million that was moved as we were moving forward to fund that with cash. And so that showed an uptick. But ultimately, the reduction is about $3.7 million, taking that, the digester money moving aside. But really, and it is riddled through the budget on what decreases. Most of the work that we did was realigning our budget with actuals to continue to try to work to realign those. I would like to highlight a couple of significant increases, mostly around the Environmental Services Division,
Yes.
which is about an $800,000 increase overall, really driven by one is compliance activities having to do with what the division does as far as managing the closed landfills. And also, which accounts for about $500,000 of that. And there is in the budget an increase in tipping fees that is anticipated in our interactions with SWAMA, the regional landfill disposal, anticipating that there will be an increase that's been communicated to us. So that has also been built into the budget.
Okay, so overall, though, you feel comfortable with what's being proposed as far as the areas that were increased and then those that are seeing decreases?
Chairman, members of the committee, yes, I do.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and open it up to questions from the committee. Councilor Romero Worth. Councilor Harris.
I provided some written questions. I don't know, do we have the answers in writing like we had for Public Works? If not, you do? Okay, well, then I'll ask some other questions. So, increasingly, one of the things for myself, Mr. Jones, and even asked yesterday of Ms. McCoy to, by department, look at the monies that's allocated for training. It's called training/tuition. I would propose we change it to training/professional development, because I think that's really what we should be talking about, and chances are that's what we're doing. But so I noticed, for instance, this would be on your, well, it's page 19 under environmental services. And this is just an example. I think there's other line items, but it's $1,000. It was $1,000. It was zero according to this in 17 and 18. $1,000 in 19, $1,000 in 20. And maybe this is a question for Ms. Sitton, but I think if I were to go through and highlight every line item, and eventually we'll have that information, I think we would find it to be low pretty consistently. There's, with the exception of HR, they seem to have a training budget. Kind of talk a little bit about whether it's environmental services or any of the other divisions under your direction. Kind of what's the approach to training has been, and what's it going to be in the future? Because this is something that I'm going to be pushing pretty hard.
Chairman, members of the committee, Councilor Harris. Yes, so the specific line item for training and tuition, or typical for divisions, gets very specific to sending someone to training or tuition reimbursement. Training is actually riddled through our budget through whether it's professional services, contractual services,
Okay.
or renting those out. A lot of training is actually done in-house.
Okay.
We do utilize both human resources and risk and safety management for trainings. But typically when you bring in a trainer, our funding would reside within like a professional service contract.
Okay.
And funding would be in those allocations.
Yeah, can you even, can you provide a guesstimate, whether it's, whatever category it falls in? Do you think that perhaps you're using 2%, 5% of your budget?
Councilor Harris, I don't know if I could tie to a percentage, but like so specifically within the wastewater's budget, I believe allocated about $15,000 for training
Okay.
in that specific line item. But again, also know within their program that they have calendars set up for each month. So again, safety training occurs monthly, and also employee development occurs monthly that's facilitated in-house. Trainings that are done outside, things like CPR certification, or a training that's tied to, again, development of the employee, where we send them to what they call regional short schools, conferences, workshops, that those are facilitated
Okay.
as well. Maintaining certification credits to keep operators certified.
Well, good. That's great to hear. So it sounds as though you've been fairly disciplined and diligent in providing adequate training and professional development. Has your budget in those regards been adequate?
Councilor Harris, I think there's always room for improvement. We're always looking for things that we can do better. I think it does fluctuate, so putting it back on the managers to really derive a training schedule for the year, and then when we do budget development, we roll those costs up. For example, within environmental services, training could fall under registration. So Ms. Sitton did point out about $19,000 in registration is where that money would reside to register for training classes.
Okay, all right.
Again, we're always looking at ways to do that diligently and really making sure that we're getting honestly the best bang for the buck and the training. That we're not just doing trainings, but we're able to measure the effectiveness of the training and development.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, given the work that utilities does in terms of operating a lot of equipment, and I'm talking, environmental services when I say that, as well as wastewater and water and everything else. And some of it's, of course, highly technical as well, which, really involves what I consider professional development. So, I'm pleased to hear that.
Councilor Harris, on that. On page 5, you've got a Santa Fe Beautiful Grant travel and training out of state per diem at $2,500. What's that for? And then on page 8, SWM administration, travel and training, employee training, tuition. You had it budgeted at $15,000, and now it's recommended at $5,000. Maybe you could just elaborate on both of those. As long as we're on the
Counselor, on the Keep Santa Fe Beautiful grant, that is only the reimbursement grant from the state for Keep Santa Fe Beautiful for that one pot of money. And so that pays for the manager or director to go to the Keep America Beautiful conference. I'm not sure.
Councilor Harris has the floor.
Yeah, on that. Councilor Rendell?
Our out-of-state per diem is about $50 a day. $2,500 would have someone left for out-of-state for about 60 days. Is that possible?
You I'm sorry, Councilor Lindell, are you talking about the Santa Fe Beautiful grant?
Yes, I am. Same question.
So that's the total cost to go to register and go to the conference, I believe. So the grant operates by the rules from the New Mexico Clean and Beautiful, or however their categories line up. None of this is actually city money. It's totally reimbursed by the state. In this particular, the Keep Santa Fe Beautiful section.
I just want to know that they're appropriate expenditures. I'm not really saying that if it's the state's money, well, it's okay to spend it if it's not our money. My point being that it says out-of-state per diem, then we have an in-state per diem, and we have an out-of-state transportation. I don't think that those numbers add up very well. I don't know how many people are going to those conventions or where they are or what.
Well, Councilor Lindell, I'll admit the way that travel is split up with in-state, out-of-state, and the labels aren't very clear, that it can be confusing. So this is really covering conference registration.
We have a
travel
separate
for
line.
the Keep America Beautiful conference, and then the in-state is for in-state meetings.
We have another line item that says registration for $625.
So out-of-state is travel, and then the registration is the $625. So the travel is the airfare, the hotel.
Right, but it still doesn't add up to an out-of-state per diem of $2,500, which it approximately $50 a day. Actually, it's less than $50 a day. I'd like for those numbers to be reconfirmed, because to me they don't add up.
Certainly, Councilor Lindell, per diem usually just means meals. That's the $50 a day you're referring to is generally meals. That's not the hotel or the airline or the taxi or.
I understand. I see a line for travel. I see a line for registration. I see a line for dues. I'm talking about a per diem. If we divide that, I mean, do we have from Santa Fe Beautiful, do we have 60 days of travel from that program? And who would be doing that amount of travel?
No one will be doing a large amount of travel, so I will reconfirm those numbers, Councilor Lindell.
Thank you, Counselor.
Okay, Councilor Harris.
All right, so I think everybody has in front of them this sheet, which is the questions. I think it just got passed out. It's right there. So I'll just go through them. I think Mr. Jones spoke to the first one, but I'd like Ms. Sitton to talk a little bit more about the 37% increase for tipping fees in solid waste admin. The answer was this was due to projected increased costs for stricter recycling protocols. Charlene will be able to give more detail.
Thank you, Councilor Harris. That number comes directly from Mr. Kippenbrock at the agency, and that is his assessment based on the Friedman recycling contract at the time at about 6,655 tons, $136 per ton, and that is his $905,000 estimate. So that's what we're using at this point. As you know, there's an RFP that is active for recycling processing contract. So we're not at a point where we know anything different from this. So this is what we're using for now.
Okay. And so I don't have it in front of me. What was did I hear you say that the increase is 900,000? I just don't have it in.
Total was 900,000.
Total's 9, and so that's, yeah, here it is. So the change is $1,005,000 from the previous year. And I'm looking at utilities. Well, this is SWM administration, page 7, so 37.7% increase.
Yeah, we have it.
Basically, I'll just repeat what I think I heard you say. And I think most everybody knows that I sit on SWAMA as well as Councilor Villarreal and Councilor Cop. Mr. Mayor, please. Thank you. No. I keep mine here in the drawer. At any rate, having sat on that board for a few years, have a lot of confidence in Mr. Kippenbrock's numbers, to tell you the truth. And so if this is generated by Mr. Kippenbrock, then I think that's probably where we're going to end up. But I do, as you said, I do know that there's an RFP out, and we'll see what happens. I think we'll probably be back with, or continue with Friedman, is my sense of things, but I don't know. All right. So utility interfund support essentially works like a transfer from the three main utilities, environmental services, water and wastewater, to the utilities admin and customer services to cover budget expenditures. Andy, do you want to speak to that? So it sounds like it's maybe not unlike the internal charges that is done within the city. This is just internal to public utilities. Is that correct?
Okay. Sorry. Mr. Chair, Councilor Harris, you are exactly correct. It is another assessment that I do, although it is limited to public utilities, and it is for that purpose to cover the cost of utilities admin and customer service.
Yeah. And then jumping down, since you're there, jumping down to the question on grants and services, 100% decrease, that's in wastewater. And then the next question, in water, it's a 100% decrease. That's 2.8, and the first one is 553,000. So your answer seems to relate to what we just talked about in terms of the utility interfund, correct?
That's correct.
So it's a different heading. So that explains those substantial numbers as far as I'm concerned. I don't know if anybody else had questions specific to those accounts. Then back up on software subscriptions, just trying to get a sense of who all is in there. Badger at 308 for the meter reading, Mountain River for utility billing, 700K, Virtuoso. Provide more details, but I guess probably my question was having to do with discussions we've had in the past, particularly in the water division, on billing and some of the issues there with the upgrade. That's not any of these three companies, is it? Because I would remember that because the company is under the Harris umbrella. Yes, indeed. Yeah. Right. So what's going on with this, and why doesn't it account for the other long-standing contract?
Mr. Chair, Council Harris, members of the committee. Before I go into that, what I'd like to point out is to the questions you provided, there's actually two responses that went. These are actually Andy's responses to the questions. There was a different email that I responded to your questions, and I'm more than happy to circulate that to go back through. But to get to your question on the Harris and the advanced utility billing system, we have just finalized the agreement amendment 8 of that contract, and Advance has put together a proposal for the scope of work of what it would take to finish the utility billing software. That is under review now by my technical team and legal to see if we can get a recommendation to bring forward before the governing body. It was actually it was my request that staff did not include budget for the advanced software because at this point I'm going to say it's unknown. And I told them that at the time, if there is a recommendation that comes forward for that contract, that I would bring forth a budget request to go with that contract. So that is why the utility billing software is not included in the budget.
My apologies. I mean, I left my iPad here last night, so and I think I saw something even the day before. I hadn't seen your response, so sorry for that. Okay, well, I think that explains why it's not showing here, and so I think all that's probably understood with finance department. But this is hopefully it's something we can get resolved. It's been going on a long time. Lien placement, and when I read this, down 90%, what went through my mind is some of the issues associated with the various the debts that we have and the uncollected fees, those types of things, which I don't know how this was connected, in terms of lien placement, but talk to me a little bit, or talk to us a little bit about that.
Chairman, Council Harris, members of the committee. I would love to tell you that we have reduced all of the accounts receivable and therefore we're not placing liens anymore, but that is not the case. Ultimately, a lot of the reduction comes back to actuals and the fact that we have automated the lien process and working very closely with Santa Fe County to streamline that process where, from my perspective, if it was costing the utility or the city, say, $25 to file each lien, well, now we're able to group those together and actually file like 50 liens at one time for the same $25. So by automating that process and working closely with Santa Fe County, streamlining the process, we're able to reduce the amount that it costs us to actually file the liens. That process is still continuing to occur, and when appropriate, we still do file the liens and make sure those are up to date.
So is it fair to say then that the actual count of liens, the number of liens that are placed is about the same, but because of the efficiency that you just described, the dollar amount is considerably less? I mean, it's maybe 20% of where it was? Okay. Is that system working pretty well? Because the accounts receivable were quite high.
Chairman, Council Harris, again, we continue to find ways to improve on managing our accounts receivable. We do feel we are approaching kind of the industry standard of where we would be. I think the approach does work. I think the issue with filing the liens is really when it becomes evident is when there's a transfer or an exchange of the property. That's when it's the most attention. But we still think it's an effective approach, and we still do maintain that is not the only way that we engage with our customers to make sure that they're being successful and we're continuing our success.
Okay, all right. Well, good move in terms of reducing the cost. I guess from $20,000 to $2,000, simply by aggregating, as you described, and working with the county. Let's see. I guess my last question was, under conservation, what are the subsidy payments for, and why the decrease?
Chairman, Council Harris, I'm sorry.
I was just, like I had been doing this real quickly there. Water conservation rebates paid to customers for installation of low-flow toilets. Water may be able to provide more detail on why this reduced amount, I'm assuming, is based on actuals. So, I guess you do need to provide a little bit more information, Mr. Jones.
Chairman, Council Harris, yes. So the subsidies, those liens are where we budget the money for the rebate programs. And so again, historically, programs evolve. So something like the toilet retrofit, which has an initial large push, and then kind of tapers off. So again, based on actuals, what we're truly budgeting for this fiscal year is driven by funding those rebate programs. Conservation has a very aggressive approach now, putting together a 5-year plan, looking for new and innovative ways to branch out into the commercial industry, trying to find new ways to incentivize and help customers, again, find ways to conserve water. But realistically, when it comes to the budgeting, being more closer to actuals, I would love to come back before the governing body and say that those programs have upticked. I just don't see it happening in this current fiscal year, and I think the proposed budget is more realistic of where we are until we can get more programs underway and continue to, again, help customers be successful.
Okay. And so this, as Ms. McCoy started out the budget hearings, it really, as she described it, as a deep dive in pretty much all line items. And to me, this would be an example of that. If we budget $500,000, but we really and truly weren't there yet, and $200,000 is more realistic, I think that's an appropriate answer. One last thing, and this is not a question I put in writing, and I don't even think this is the right time, but thinking about the water fund and the wastewater fund and what those amounts are and how it relates to a capital program within each of those divisions, when would we be talking about that? Not now, but when would we be talking about what your capital programs look like and what it may mean for those funds. We talked around it a little bit when we floated the bond for the digester project, but not really too much. I think Ms. McCoy was prepared to answer.
Mr. Chairman, Councilor Harris, later today in the section of the agenda for staff follow-up, we're going to be passing out a capital outlay sheets. We will be having a capital outlay hearing to review these projects tomorrow, and there are some of the capital outlay projects for the public utilities as well. We have the ability to meet with the department, has the ability to meet with the Finance Committee and the governing body every 2 weeks to bring any additional projects forward, as Director Jones mentioned with the advanced billing software. So that could also be something that the council sees throughout the remainder of the year. And I will defer to Director Jones for any additional information he can provide about the CIP schedule.
Thank you, Mary. Chairman, members of the committee. Yes, so in utilities, mainly driven around the water has many capital improvement projects, as well as wastewater. Those are discussions that happen within the engineering section daily. We do come periodically before the Public Utilities Committee with updates on our capital projects. We are working very close with the Finance Committee for ongoing projects, current CIPs that are underway for the reappropriation, which will be included. And we've also met with Public Works and continuing conversations with them on really what I would probably characterize as a facilities-based capital project, and where we touch Public Works, where we integrate communication between when we dig up streets and when they pave them and make sure that timing is correct. And then more systematic CIPs where we would focus on tanks, boosters, plant upgrades. And so, again, we do have that information. It's constantly evolving. We've now kicked off with the Water Division development of the Asset Management Plan, which is a good indicator to have in place, but also allows us to qualify for potential funding in the future. So as that's continuing to develop, we'll also monitor how that affects and potential recommendations to future operating budgets and how it can impact our capital improvement budget as well.
So, I guess one last question. Fee structure within the various divisions. There's no proposed fee increases within, with the exception of the tipping fees that we talked about. And is it anticipated that that would then, at some point in the near future, maybe in the coming fiscal year, drive potentially an increase in environmental services fees?
Chairman, Councilor Harris, I think I would have to say that that's absolutely a consideration. We know that it will have an impact. Our financial consultant works very close with the divisions as we look at cost of service studies and the continuation of the financial plan. But that is absolutely something that is on our radar. We do know that it has that impact, and if there's nothing that we can do to mitigate that, then it would resonate into the form of a recommended rate increase.
Right now, is that the only division where you kind of really need to look closely at potential fee increases?
Currently, that is one that I'm most aware of. I will mention, as we came forward with the green bond for the wastewater division, one of the questions was how will this impact rates? We did a lot of work and a lot of modeling to, again, mitigate that impact, mainly driven by the fact that on the bond, we do defer, that we only pay interest for a couple of years, not necessarily because of the money, but because of the debt-to-service ratio, making sure that it doesn't dip below the level of service, and by deferring the payment, allowing other investments to transpire, we're able to kind of to avoid that rate increase, which put wastewater in a good position. Currently, it's my understanding that water is also in a good position. We're currently working with the task force to actually look at the structure, not necessarily the operational cost and the revenues that come in, but how we delineate those costs. And I'm looking very forward to having those conversations and open dialogues with our task force on how do we currently do business, and is there a potential for improvement?
Thank you, Director Jones. Those are very good answers. Appreciate it.
Councilor Lindell.
My questions on the numbers have been answered, Chair. I'll wait till the next round to talk about general programs and such.
Thank you. Councilor Rivera.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Shirlene, or Janet, I guess on page 7, there's the second line down on compliance services, which took a pretty big increase. What is that for?
Yeah, so one of the increases I talked about was the compliance for environmental services. This is an increase for state mandated improvements that environmental services has to do on the 2 currently closed landfills, and work that they're going to have to do there as far as monitoring wells and mitigation work that they will be doing.
And I saw the numbers on that was just handed out by City Manager Litzenberg on the tipping fees, but why would the recycling money be under the landfill tip fees?
Mr. Chair, Councilor Rivera, that's just where it is. You can
Has it always
work-
been under that?
evidently, if those are just really all that it's a bundle of the fees that we pay to the agency.
Right. Now, I don't know if negotiations have started with SWAM. I know it's separate from city negotiations, I think a little bit different union, but are they planning an increase for personnel again?
Pardon me, sir, is the agency planning to increase personnel?
Increase personnel raises. I don't know if
I'm not aware.
negotiations have begun, started, or where they're at. Do you know what that answer is yet?
I'm sorry, sir, I don't, but I will look into it. And
On that point, Chair, we actually are going through our own budget hearing for SWAMA, so I know there has been a request for increase for pay for employees, but we haven't confirmed or approved those budgets yet. Thank you.
Okay, that $1 million, or the 37+% increase, that's just the city's portion. Do you know what the county's portion is?
not a quarter? Is that, I don't know.
I just want to make sure we're not picking up the whole total of what's going on at SWAMA. It's being shared proportionately, I guess.
Right. Yes, that's correct, Chair. Councilor Rivera. But it seems like in our interactions where the regional bridge across the city county, I would say typically the rule of thumb is about 75%, 25%. So if there's an impact that we see, my typical rule of thumb is that's about the ratio between the 2 entities.
On page 17, capital purchases, pretty high number for vehicles less than 1.5. Is that commercial, residential recycling? What kind and how many smaller vehicles are we going to be purchasing?
Councilor Rivera, I have a list of just the vehicles, if you would like a copy of that, broken out, because the vehicles are spread out among the budget.
What types of vehicles for commercial, residential are you looking at?
For residential trash, we have two side load collection vehicles for residential trash.
Okay, are
We
those
do have a
vehicles,
small vehicle, 566, that we're replacing the unit.
are those less than 1.5?
The admin replace unit 566, that's less than 1.5. Might not have all of the small vehicles on this list.
That's a pretty big budget for a department that uses larger vehicles than the less than 1.5, so.
Let me compile all the vehicles for you.
It's only out of commercial and residential recycling, is that it, or commercial and residential, is that what that line item's out of?
Chairman, no, I think it is both, but also knowing that it is a division that does multiple large vehicles, but also the division does, there are also vehicles for supervisors, for other field service checks, so there are smaller vehicles that reside within that fleet, and even vehicles that reside under 1.5 ton that are actually used for collection as well. Especially so when you consider there are, smaller streets in Santa Fe that you don't roll a large garbage truck down, and they use these smaller trucks to access those locations.
So yeah, if you could provide us a breakdown, that would be great. Specific to the less than 1.5. And that would be page 17, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines down, the sixth line. Councilor Rivera.
Thank you. On page 26, the sixth line down again, where it's salary, so it's taken a pretty big decrease, 156, probably at least 2 people. Are we losing staff in that area? Or are we budgeting for less staff in that area?
Chairman, Councilor Villa, could you refer to that line again?
Page 26, line 6.
I think what we're seeing there is, if the council's unaware, I apologize, but so the current fiscal year that we're in, utility billing took over operations of the cashiering staff. So there's 3 cashiers and a supervisor that interacts with the customers all through the day, taking those payments. Last fiscal year, those individuals resided within the finance department, but effective July 1st of this year, we took on the cashiering. So I think the changes that we're seeing is reflecting that change of ownership from utilities paying into the general fund to provide to the finance department to us taking on those responsibilities.
Well, then wouldn't the budget increase instead of decrease?
Right, you're showing a
Yeah, so the budget would remain relatively neutral because the budget we already paid for the position. It was just how it was facilitated. I'm going to say I think many of those changes just has to do with as higher paid staff retires and you hire new staff coming in and how those align. But we have not lost any people. There's still 3 cashiers and a supervisor.
You know why the budget would be less, Mr. Corr?
Mr. Chairman, Councilor Rivera, I don't have the detail on that specific business unit, but we will provide that to you from a year-over-year comparison. Would that be sufficient?
Sure.
Okay, great.
On page 33, 520100, the repair maintenance building structures. Like a pretty big hit from there. Maybe all the repairs have been done, but it seems like older buildings seem to need the same amount of repairs every year. Can you just speak to that? Is it something that's already been taken care of?
Yes, Chairman, Councilor Rivera, members of the committee. That actual reduction was a budget expenditure that wastewater had for a natural gas line repair that we did. And so again, so it is within the administration budget. That's how we funded it. We're not anticipating funding it again.
I know you have that building that's pretty old. Are there typically issues that have to be dealt with on a yearly basis, or is that building pretty solid?
Chairman, Councilor Rivera, there are modifications that are built in the budget. I know that they did some work to restucco the face of the building with the gas line repair. Not only did we repair the leak, but all the gas lines were replaced in, I think, 6 buildings. All got new piping throughout the buildings. It's a continual assessment. We do work with Public Works for the facility management. I know Amoresco was on site. They have our assets listed in their software system that identifies the conditional assessment, and we work very closely with them on those repairs needed. There are a couple of projects that we do have listed on there. There's some roof repairs that have to occur. How we manage those, I know there was a roof repair that has to occur, but we're actually redoing that building as part of an aeration upgrade. And so working with Public Works, we're kind of taking that away from the facilities. They may still have project managers involved, but we'll attach it to the construction project where another building may not be being upgraded or rehabbed, and we would work with them to repair that roof or HVAC system.
Okay. On page 38, wastewater, 501,400, the overtime budget, you're taking a big drop in that, so.
Chairman, Councilor Rivera, again, I'm going to say those are based on actuals, just again, realigning the budget with typically what we see.
Are those factored in other places?
The overtime?
Is there much overtime in that department?
There's quite a bit of overtime in the division, mostly within the treatment plant. That is a 24-hour operation. Some of the other sections have standby call-in. The collections, of course, they occur that. The other ones, like the industrial pretreatment in the lab, there would be minor amounts of overtime, maybe special sampling on a weekend or lab analysis that have to be run or special projects. But again, the majority of the overtime, I would say, is the actual treatment plant operation. And then second to that would be the collection, the on-call people responding to overflows or backup stoppages.
And on that point, last year you had budgeted 90,000, but when you look at the actuals for 18 and 17, 6,660 is in line with Ms. McCoy explained to us yesterday or the day before about overtime. You're taking the last 2 years, averaging it, and that's how you're basing the overtime. So if you don't look at the other two, it looks like you're going from 90,000 to 6,000, but when you actually look at the actuals, that's in line with what we've been hearing. Thank you. Thank you, Councilor Rivera.
Lastly, on page 57, uh, 530,200 under operating supplies. So, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding was like inventory exempt operating supplies could only be spent for like items that are less than 1,000 or less than 1,500. That's how it was way back. Is that still the rules today?
Chairman, Councilor Rivera, I would say the operating supplies for this particular one's transmission and distribution would actually facilitate. I don't necessarily. No, it wouldn't necessarily be under just $1,000. There's things that fall within that line that we would call operating supplies. So I could very easily see them taking even a several hundred or a several $1,000 valve that they're having installed could come from an operating supply.
Because back in the day, the procurement book said inventory examples less than 1,000. Did it have anything specific for operating supplies? Any specific rules on that?
Mr. Chairman, Councilor Rivera, I don't believe it does have anything specific to operating supplies to limit the amount.
Okay, just making sure. That's a lot of money to spend small amounts at a time. I think that's it. And just wanted to, so back on the per diem question. So there are times where you travel, not you specifically, but people within your department may travel and they bring back receipts, they get reimbursed in that fashion. Is that correct?
Chairman, Councilor Rivera, that is correct. There's it would get reimbursed. There is a mechanism of which the city could pay a projected up to 80% to kind of front cost that, but then we true it up with the receipts when they return.
Right, and that was my other question. There's another part of the per diem rule where if you go, let's say, to New York for a conference, which is much higher expense rate, I think certain cities have a certain value of per diem. So some place like New York might be $150 a day per diem, where some small city where you may be going may only be $60. Is that correct?
Yes, sir, that is correct.
Okay, so it's based basically on where the training is, how it's set up, the level of the city, I guess, of expenses in that location. Is that still how it works?
It is. So again, within that per diem, where we're budgeting, it's not just a set rate of how many miles or how much food per day, but also, again, things like hotel costs, parking fees, taxi, so again, bringing those receipts back, making sure it trues up with the true cost, to have the money budgeted to reimburse those.
Right, so more expensive cities are gonna require more funding than smaller cities that may not be as expensive. Okay, just wanted to make sure that was still it.
Counselor Lindell.
Counselor? On that point, I checked with Celeste on traveling, and you're absolutely right. But $47 per day is the highest amount to the higher cost cities.
47.
Correct.
Counselor Romero Worth, did you have any comment on that point?
No, I wanted to ask a couple questions when it's appropriate.
Go ahead, Counselor Romero Worth.
Sorry.
Mr. Chair, councilors, I was going to clarify. I think what Councilor Lindell is talking about is the food-only per diem. It's significantly higher than that when you're including per diem for a hotel stay as well.
We'll get a breakdown. That's part of the information you're going to return to us. Counselor Romero Worth.
Okay, on page 54, on contracts, I guess it's service contracts for the Water Division let's see, the fund name is Water Division Operating, not, for the water, expenditure of the Water Division source of supply. You have a decrease of $104,000. Just curious what that's about. Is that just a contract you don't need anymore, or is this a truing up against actuals? What's that number?
Chairman, Councilor Worth, yes. It's just realigning it closer with actuals.
Okay, and then similar question on, see if I can find it. I marked it. Here it is, page 51. Same deal. This is in the Water Division Conservation. They had professional contracts at $33,941. Not needed anymore or finished? Because there's nothing recommended in contractual services here for the coming fiscal year.
Right. Chairman, Councilor Worth, so what I believe is really those expenditures align from professional contracts into service contracts. And again, realigning that with actuals that was previously.
So, and there were a couple of them I noticed too in wastewater. I mean, is that pretty much true across the board for those kinds of contracts?
That is correct.
No, there's no big change or big project finished or anything like that that accounts for those differences?
No, Chairman, Councilor Worth, and I think if and so typically along those lines of contracts, something like wastewater is so things like compliance studies, or so typically you either go cylindrical or you move from. So again, where this year maybe you had $20,000 that you expended in a study that is complete, that's done, but this year what you do is focus on maybe a different constituent, and you just reappropriate the same amount of funding into a continuation of study over a broader tree.
Okay, thank you. That's all for now.
Hey, Councilor Villarreal, did you have questions regarding these line items?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to clarify, and I apologize if you might have answered this before I walked in, I think it's just to understand the numbers, and it's great to get all the details of the divisions, but it also then has us picking apart things. So thanks for bearing with us. On page 12 for environmental services, I didn't see in the general increases for any staff, but the salary general went up by 102. Was that a position? It was for curbside personnel services on page 12 under salaries. And the increase went up to it was a 102,000 increase. So I was trying to find in your notes if that was due to a full-time position or.
Mr. Chairman, Councilor Villarreal, as we have reviewed the position listing throughout the city, we've discussed this a few other times, we have started to make corrections, potentially positions that were supposed to live in certain business units that have not previously been budgeted to those positions.
Got it.
So we have been continuing, and I'm sure this will continue, going forward as well as we start to understand, right, going through reorganization citywide as well. There will continue to be these changes between the divisions within a department.
That's helpful. Do we know what position it was, though, that wasn't?
So Counselor Villarreal,
Right.
every year there's a shift bid to add to the issue. Every year there's a shift bid, and so we have shuffling of positions or people from one section to another, and that adds to the problem. And so our POL is rarely actually reflects what is true in reality, and so we're really glad that we've been working to clean that up with finance.
Great. Okay, so then this may be the same thing for page 51 under the Water Division and Conservation. Same thing, it says salaries. There was 407, and the fiscal year 20 says 632, so there's a difference of 225,000. So is that the same concept, or is this
Chair, yeah, I would say that would be the same concept. Again, position IDs, where they're funded, and aligning those.
I think that's it.
Councilor
Thank you.
Villarreal, Councilor Vihil-Coppler.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess I'll start with the questions. We did get an FTE count in our materials, and can we be sure that we have 245 positions based on what Ms. McCoy just said? Looking at this.
Mr. Jones, you know approximately how many positions you have in your department?
Chairman, members of the committee, Councilor Villar-Coppler. So typically, I like to pride myself on being able to just provide the numbers, but I think the exercise that they were going through, I would have said that utilities is 288 employees.
200 and what?
288, based on information that I've had historically. Again, working very close with the finance and the human resource department about cleaning up positions that are double filled, positions that didn't exist, things that have changed over years. Again, we've worked very close with them, and so I do stand with the HR and the finance department that I think they've done a tremendous job in identifying those positions.
Mr. Chairman, Councilor Vihil-Coppler, also to clarify, the listing that you will have going forward for each of the departments will be the last page of the narrative. So if you want to turn to that, I don't have public utilities in front of me right now, but the 4 different classifications that were requested we have here. So elected, exempt, classified, interim. What is not showing here is any seasonal or temporary employees, and that might actually be what gets us to the 288 number that Director Jones referenced earlier. So that would not be on here, and those are subject to funding as well. So and subject to need.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chair, what are we looking at? What is that? Was this today?
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
So that would mean 33 seasonal
Or seasonal, or what other category?
and
Temporary?
or temp?
Mr. Chair,
Yes, Councilor Vihil-Coppler.
just a general statement, and I will keep making it. I'm just, well, first of all, I don't think we have a classification called seasonal. And that's just like when they work, maybe during the summer, fall season, et cetera. And I continue to be concerned about the lack of the information being presented to us, and without specific FTEs. I know you're working on them, and I appreciate that. But human resources is probably 80 or 90% of our budget. And I'm very concerned about not being able to track those, because those are those are recurring costs, and they can become and will become very, very expensive. And I know there's nothing we can do right now, but it's very difficult to really approve a budget knowing that there's so many unknowns. And when you get to a point where you don't know where your positions are, what require benefits and what don't, and what those actual costs are, I find it to be a very irresponsible way of approving a budget. And I know that statement is not to cast any stones against anyone, but it is a concern. And what I worry about now is what decisions are being made to maybe let some people have some positions and or departments and some not, and how those decisions are being made. But you know, I will have a lot more questions when we get to what the information that you'll provide. What I want to know on this particular sheet is the term position, I guess, being requested, or it was approved and now it's, I don't understand this chart, fiscal year recommended position count. That doesn't mean you're requesting a term, does it? It just means you're recommending you keep your positions that you have. So what's the point?
So Chairman, Councilor Vihil-Coppler, the position count analysis that we will be providing with each department and then a total reconciliation citywide demonstrates the attention to detail and the deep dive that Councilor Harris spoke of earlier that HR and finance staff has gone through over the course of the last 6 months working with each of the departments to be able to get to a point where we have reconciled the FY19 approved position count, which is what you see in one column, for each of these 4 classifications. In addition to that, the FY20 recommended position count for this department shows an increase of classified positions of 4, and that change is due to the 4 cashiers moving from the finance department budget that were referenced earlier into the public utilities budget. And the reason this is a recommendation is because the funding source will also accompany that as part of the budget. And this, I believe, is an extremely helpful tool for us throughout the fiscal year as we continue to monitor positions and where they sit as they are approved by this governing body.
Thank you. And the last point on the FTEs that's kind of linked to this is I'm still concerned about what is happening to the career ladder in comparison to the Canyon Road and Buckman plant on that. And we've met on that, so I will be watching what is going to happen there. The next question I have deals with the Buckman diversion, DDD, whatever. I can never say it right. What happens to the county's contribution? How is it folded into these budgets? I can't really, is there a transfer in for that, or how does that work?
Chairman, Councilor Vihil-Coppler. So each entity, the city and county, we budget for our portion of the operating budget. Then the Buckman Direct Diversion, as they operate, bill the entities for the level of service. And so what Ms. Romero does is she sends out an invoice. We come into the budget resides within, for the city, within the water division, and they pay that invoice, and that's what covers their expenditures. So the county would actually receive an invoice, and that's what would bring in the funding.
So where does that money, where are the expenditures in this budget?
Mr. Chair, BDD and SWAMA do their own independent budgets for their own board. They are not in any of these packets.
Okay, I know
and
that.
their board
I know that, but we have to pay them. We have to pay our portion into that, right? Is that what just Mr. Jones just said? And so I'm just asking, where does that money come from?
Where is it in your budget?
Chairman, Councilor Vihil-Coppler, it is a $6 million line item. I'm looking to see what page that is on now, but it is in here. I checked to make sure it was budgeted.
So we give $6 million toward that?
So the Water
Sorry,
Division
I was
budget's $6 million. Currently, the recommended or approved Buck Director Diversion budget is a $9 million budget, of which $6 million, or about 75%, is City of Santa Fe. So we budget the $6 million, and then as Buckman Direct Diversion runs and they incur those expenditures, they invoice us and we pay down the budget amount into the Buckman Direct.
Okay, and then, would that also include legal fees, or where does that money come from? Because we're spending them now.
Legal fees for Buckman Direct Diversion or for the water, or for who?
Well, we're involved in a tither, so,
The Buckman Direct Diversion is?
yes. So I just wondered what our contribution, where does that money, does that come out of the $6 million, legal fees?
Chairman Counselor, it does. It is included in their operating budget as where we fund it. The the BDD source of supply is on page 48. I'd say maybe about the 7th or 8th line down. And I stand corrected. The recommended budget in this packet is $7.2 million.
48, you said?
The 8th line down. And so all fees related to Buckman Direct Diversion comes out of that. So in other words, there's not separate things we have to pay for throughout the year from different places. Whatever we pay, like now this $7.2 million will cover everything related to Buckman Direct Diversion. Lawsuits, whatever they're dealing with, that's our share.
That is correct.
Thank you.
And in the event there's any kind of settlement of any sort, are these funds used in that regard too?
Chairman, Councilor Copper, what I would expect is that there would, the same way we develop the budget, is that would still be facilitated in the Buckman Direct Diversion with the partners involved. If they were looking at reimbursement of money, either to use it or how it gets reimbursed back to partners, that would go before the BDD board, and that there would be a recommendation that would come out of the board that would go to both the BCC and the governing body of the city for approval. But I would expect a recommendation to come from the board on how that's done.
Do we have any kind of insurance coverage for things like this?
Mr. Chair, councilors, we do. I don't know to what extent it applies here. We could find out, but the city does have insurance for high claims.
And if I may, Mr. Chair, if you'll cover, so the city does have an umbrella policy that does incorporate Buckman Direct Diversion, but also the Buckman Direct Diversion does also have its own insurance policy that's facilitated. So there is information on that.
Okay, thank you. Another question is on the cover sheet of revenue and expenses and the like. The environmental services paper bag fee. So is this what we're collecting on that fee? I mean, we budget, what do we budget?
Mr. Chair,
Right now,
Councilor Vihil Coppler, yes, the bag fee revenues are projected based on the last couple of years of the revenues coming in. So that's purely based on the revenues, which are separated, and then by the bag fee ordinance says would be spent on waste reduction activities and reusable bags.
That's what I was going to ask is what you spend that money on. Because that's a question I get asked a lot.
Right.
Are we really collecting it, and what do we spend it on?
Right. Well, so the budget is
And I'm happy to say I've never.
it's
paid a
mostly
dime.
all under postage, which is for the calendars and for retail letter that we send out periodically to the retailers who are using bags to remind them about the bag fee. For printing calendars, for printing, many of the various things that we do in advertising for waste reduction and recycling, and the bring your own bag advertising in particular, and then reusable bags that we give away. the bulk of what we spend the money on.
Do we have any kind of oversight on, you mentioned businesses to remind them about the bags. Do we have any, is that the only oversight we do?
So I believe, and that was designed a little before my time, but as I have been directed, and I believe as the ordinance is written with a little bit of a light touch, we've never had to do anything too draconian. We remind, most people self-report and do a good job of complying. We do have a person in our office who does all kinds of compliance activities for the various solid waste things, and he does the bag ordinance as well. So we're all on the lookout. If anybody reports that they have gotten a bag that violates the ordinance, we go out there in person and remind them, bring them a copy of the ordinance, and make sure they get back in line. We don't have any kind of level of staffing to consistently go out to every store and check. So there's a bit of reporting that we rely on from the general public, from the governing body, if you go shopping, from anyone who has an experience, and any time we get anything like that, we check on it right away. But we just by observation, I feel like we have pretty good compliance, and again, any time that we have had to direct, a manager or a store owner, they get in line.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, we'll spend a few minutes on general questions for the department, and then I'm going to ask for a motion. Councilor Lindell.
I just wanted to talk for a minute about this email from Mr. Kippenbrock on the tipping fees. I'm wondering if you think that we're going to need to have a conversation in the very near future about the environmental services remaining an enterprise fund.
I'm sorry, what, Councilor Lindell, what?
Well, with the enterprise funds are essentially defined as or departments that generate the fees to cover their costs. I don't know how we're going to be able to generate the fees to cover this kind of costs. Do we need to have a conversation in the very near future about our recycling programs and our environmental services remaining an enterprise fund?
Thank you, Councilor Lindell. I believe an enterprise fund is absolutely the best kind of fund for environmental services. We charge rates. We have many different rates, as you know, for commercial and residential collection. We actually do have a cost of service study underway right now, and it coincides with a cost of service study for the agency. And so we'll be able to have, it's the same consultant doing the cost of service study, and we'll be bringing all of that information forward on what kind of rate adjustments we may need to have to make sure that all of our programs are viable. We do have a recycling processing RFP that is open right now, and information about how that contract may move forward, I believe, should be coming back at the next agency meeting. So we'll have better information on that as well. So I firmly believe we're in a good place. We'll probably have to have some rate adjustments, but we have some of, if not the lowest, rates in the state. So there may need to be some rate adjustments. I don't want to go on record of saying we do or don't need them until we have that report.
What's the time frame on the completion of this study?
Councilor Lindell, it's actually due to be completed within the month.
So it is April, so should we expect to have May 1st? Sorry. Let me start over. Let me go out and come back in. When should we expect to have that in our hands?
Councilor Lindell, I have targeted and let the Public Utilities Committee know that we're hoping to come back with some kind of report in June.
Okay, in June?
For the Public Utilities Committee,
Okay.
that's our target.
Could we also have it at finance, because I'm sure it's going to have a financial component to it. So if we could have a presentation at finance also, if the chairman thinks that's appropriate.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions, Councilor Lindell? Anything else from the committee? Councilor Romero Worth?
So I'm just curious, Mr. Jones, how we're doing on hiring a water division permanent person. Is that, are you still advertising? Have you got somebody in mind? Where are we in that process?
Chairman, Councilor Romero Worth. For the Water Division Director, that position has closed. We were going through the interview process. We have one final interview scheduled for next week and hoping to be able to make a recommendation on that for the position. If by some chance we can't move forward with the recommendation, that is the last interview, and we would repost the position and broaden the search. Okay, and then in your budget, have you budgeted for I guess this goes back to the contractual services line items, unless we're doing it in-house, for more public outreach, public input around the different water reuse options and trying to understand, the differences and what's the correct path for us to go down. I know we're looking tonight at the amendment to the Carollo contract. Is that the only thing that you're looking at, or have you budgeted to do other community outreach around that topic? Chairman, Councilor Merrill Worth. There's nothing specific in the budget to that type of community outreach specific for reuse. So again, the intent would be is once staff came forward with a formalized plan and what the costs are. If I could facilitate that work within the existing budget, that would be my preferred intent. If it's not, then typically that amount of effort would come before the governing body for approval of the amount of that contract or program. And at the time, I would request a budget adjustment and do a budget from cash to cover that. That would be my preferred approach.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Councilor Harris, did you have any other questions? Okay, what about Councilor Villarreal or Councilor Beal-Coppler? Okay, Mayor, did you want to chime in before we call for a motion on this?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A couple quick items. Since we're not doing line items, we're doing more policy and priorities. A lot of what we focus on is what the city is doing, but I think we all know that a great deal of the work that gets done in your department has to do with residents taking responsibility and doing the right thing. Two things in particular that I've been a beneficiary of are downloading the Eye on Water app and having a home conservation visit, both of which have been incredibly impressive to me in terms of the capacity to make a difference in water use and water conservation. Any thoughts on how we can do an even better job promoting those elements that residents can take it upon themselves to be a participant in a more sustainable Santa Fe?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Anything better than the shout-outs you just gave us? It'd be hard to top that. But again, we are integrating that into our programs, making sure the information is out. Again, our community outreach, dealing with our customers, looking at also tying it to our procedures. Potentially, again, the Eye on the Water app is, again, it's information that helps the customer know what it is they're using and give them those alerts. So right now there's a lot of discussion around how we can integrate that onto our policies and procedures as far as when you set up an account or if you enter into a payment arrangement or any time that we're in contact with the customer, how can we interface and add that in along with, again, our community outreach, any table where we're at, Having the ability to sign up in the field, so we've been working very close with IT to get staff the ability to log in the field into that billing system and get them set up. So again, these are all positive things. Looking to increase the number of people signed up.
Mayor, Mr. Chair, if I can just add to that, my understanding is, we're about to go into I guess what you call the high demand season. And I was meeting with Christine Chavez about the water conservation meeting that's coming up in, I don't know, a week or a week and a half, something like that. And we will be having an agenda item on exactly this item. And my understanding is, as part of rolling into the high demand season, there's some marketing efforts that the city is embarking on to increase the usage of the Eye on Water app, and also just advertising to raise awareness about water conservation as we go into the spring, summer season.
Thank you.
Mayor, if I may, I'm really excited about what we're working on and the things that we've finally been able to produce within Environmental Services for outreach. Just a little more than 6 months ago, I didn't have any staff to do that. We've had retirements and people leave, and now not only have we been able to fill positions with really quality people, but we have also, as you know, we've been able to move a former staff member back in, sustainability expert back into our fold, and we're just waiting on our offer for another new sustainability planner, and we've really been able to start. It hasn't been a matter of funds. We really are blessed that we have the funds to do the outreach, especially because of the bag fee that really supplements our ability to do advertising. But just as you saw the sustainability wrap that we did for Earth Day, we have new commercials coming out. I know there was a little hitch, but the calendar has finally come out, and it is chock full of information. And the calendar next year will actually focus on the sustainability plan, and we just have a lot of things in development, and we're going to have so much more ability as we become staffed up. So we're really excited, and hope that you are starting to see some of those things.
Thank you. I do think what you were saying, Shannon, about when people making the Eye on Water app a part of your of an individual's bill payment, the point of contact becomes a chance to have people opt in on the spot, or make it as you get your water service, you opt in. You have to opt out, or you get it. Changes the dynamic significantly from anticipating that people will automatically do it. If we change it from opt-in to opt-out, I think we'll get a really big bump in the utilization, and it'll change people's behavior. I know just that kind of information in the palm of your hand or on your laptop makes a big difference in terms of behavior. That's all I have. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, can I have a motion regarding the Public Utilities Department budget? A motion, is there a second? Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Those opposed, motion carries. Thank you, Mr. Jones. Okay, we will hear from the Planning and Land Use Department. Ms. Johnson, if you could introduce who's here with you, or who's going to be speaking.
I actually have a handout of our organization chart that'll help make that a little easier.
Okay, and then as we look at your budget, there's quite a bit going on, or what you're proposing quite a bit. 17% increase, increase in your land use administration, building permits, current planning, historic preservation. There's a minor one in the MPO and technical review. So I'm going to allow you, before we just dig into the numbers, to go ahead and talk to us a little bit about why the increases, what your goals are for the department, et cetera. So go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. I'm going to introduce the staff that are here with me right now, and I'll ask that they raise their hand. First, we have Bobby Padilla, who is the Division Director for Inspections. Greg Smith, who is moving into the division director role for code compliance, but we also have James Martinez here, who is the supervisor for that. We have Eric Ani, who is the MPO officer for the Metropolitan Planning Organization. Lisa Roche, who is our latest hire. She has just been selected to permanently fill the planner manager position for the Historic Preservation Division. And then also Eli Isaacson, who's the division director for our building division. So the handout that I've given to you, the all black side shows the current organization, and as you can see, it's quite flat. All the divisions reporting directly to me, and the proposed organization is on the other side with the color. And so the main difference, and this is reflected in some of the salary increases for this division, is that we're proposed to add 2 assistant director positions. And this change is all revenue neutral, using salary savings, unfilled vacancies that are existing in the land use department currently. And what this will do is add an operational layer that will allow much faster response to the staff that need assistance with solving problems, dealing with customers. We'll have 3 people that will be able to deal with those issues instead of just 1. And then it'll allow me to focus a little bit more on development of our budget and contract administration and other administration. So getting back to your questions about the overall trends for the department, under land use administration, there are a number of positions that are being moved around, and as you can see on this proposed organization chart, there's an addition of the land use property manager, Ed V. Hill, who's proposed to be reassigned from the Asset Development Office into the Land Use Department. Also a land use project administrator, and, that's an existing position, a land use project manager. And this was a position added to the organization to help with the implementation and ongoing maintenance of our piece of the ERP project. We were struggling to find personnel applicants with the correct qualifications for that position, so it's just recently been reclassified to a business analyst, and that was just posted yesterday. So this is going to be a key component to map out processes, develop FAQs, all of the guidance documents that are necessary not only for staff but for the general public, so that they can better know how to successfully interact with this new permitting system when it goes live later this summer. A lot of what we've been doing is reallocating positions between business units. So that is why there is the increase in the land use administration. Building permit division is increased because we're proposed to add a higher level plan review position that would deal with the more complex plumbing, electrical, and mechanical reviews. Current planning, we've moved the remaining long-range senior planner into that division. Historic preservation, we've added an additional permit tech and also reclassified the head of that group to a higher level position. Inspections and enforcement is showing a decrease because some of those staff are being moved into a newly created compliance division. The same with long-range planning, that's essentially going away in its entirety. There's a minor increase to deal with cost of living increases with the Metropolitan Planning Organization, and then technical review is a minor increase because of a salary differential between the current city engineer and the previous incumbent. And I also want to introduce Nick Schiavo, our city engineer, who is now heading up that technical review division. And I'm sorry, Noah Burke also came in when I had my back turned. Noah Burke is the manager of the planning division.
Okay, so questions from the committee. Councilor Lindell.
Actually, Chair, I don't have questions on the numbers. I just have conceptual questions. So I know that the way that you've been running this and doing the numbers first and then doing a second round, I think it's been very efficient for us. So I'll pass.
Okay, on the numbers, Councilor Harris.
You know, I had, most of my questions, I think, were probably acknowledged and answered in Ms. Johnston's presentation, because as I started to look at the various divisions and I looked at the salaries in relation to the vacancies, I mean, it was all over the map. Went from an understandable one of 50.9% decrease in long range to historic preservation 42.5. One I really couldn't understand was inspection and enforcement. It was a decrease of 4%. So without asking you to go through all that again, I'll accept your explanation. I did wonder, I noticed that we had a very low vacancy credit for current planning of, like, on salaries, 0.5%, 0.5%. You've got a salary increase, and, you know, I don't know how deep we want to go into that, but anyways, that was just a disconnect that I didn't quite understand. Neighborhood services, that's a title I'd not seen before. Talk to me about the neighborhood services position.
Certainly. Thank you, Councilor Harris, Chairman and members of the committee. That assignment currently goes to Lee Logston, who's one of our senior planners, and functionally he's been a member of the current planning team. It's my understanding that we've got a couple holdovers of old business units that may have just one individual assigned to them, and from a practical standpoint, they haven't functioned as a separate business unit or organization within the department for quite some time. In fact, it wasn't until we started embarking on this process of the budget that I was even aware that he was assigned to a separate business unit.
Okay. And, you know, I don't remember the absolute number, but it seemed like it was 50,000, 55,000, something like that.
For that.
For that. So, in other words, maybe half that individual's time, something like that. Okay. You know, I didn't really know where to find it. Maybe, and I'm thinking about yesterday's discussion with Parks and Rec, and I think, I mean, Ms. McCoy characterized your response as the Director of Planning and Land Use as gracious as we worked through that, and I thought that was, I think it was a great acknowledgement of your understanding and willingness to help. But is that, which line item would that be? I'm looking at really essentially page 1 under Land Use Administration, Service Contracts.
It's right, correct. It's the very last line. So there are a number of contracts that are all lumped into that that item. You should have.
Mr. Chairman, Councilor Harris, just to clarify, the spreadsheets that you have in front of you should be the updated ones after our after the council's action or the committee's action yesterday. We did update the planning and land use to reflect that change. So on page 1 that you were referencing, it would be the contractual service 510-310 service contracts line item,
Right.
and the FY20 revised column would be 377 for the new total after the to reflect the committee's actions yesterday.
Okay, all right. I see that now. I had actually not seen the column heading, and so that explains that. So basically, the approximate $375,000, right? I mean, that's, I mean, it was a total of 4. 25 came from the community services, and then the balance came from this one particular line item. Correct?
So
It was
we
almost
saw the
twice.
sheet.
It was
Right.
the increase was essentially twice of what we have under revised number.
Mr. Chairman, that is correct. Council.
And so, I mean, we know that that was possible. It was possible to do this given the 3-year program for the code updates.
Correct. And if I could just expand on that, Councilor Harris, Chairman and members of the committee, it wasn't just the code update. So the 2 primary work items that the Land Use Department is focusing on for the next fiscal year is initiating the code update with a technical review, but also embarking on a community visioning and neighborhood planning program. And it's still nascent, so it hasn't been completely determined whether or not we're going to embark into a comprehensive general plan update or look at breaking that update into a series of area plans. But regardless, we still need to do a broader visioning and develop a framework for that exercise.
Right, and I actually, in reading, understood that was the question. I want to say I really am proud of the fact that you and your department are taking this on, because this is no small matter, and quite frankly, I think for quite a while, for whatever reason, people have just stuck their head in the sand until now. So I applaud you for that. Well, and part of that, what about historic preservation? Is that to be included in the code update? General code update?
Councilor and members of the committee and chairman, yes. We actually had 40,000 already identified for historic preservation. There are several grant opportunities that are coming up through the state, and that 40,000 was intended to be matching funds. The priority, and I can let Ms. Roach speak to this, would be a historic preservation plan that would help us identify subsequent studies that would be necessary to establish context for specific historic periods and specific geographies within the city. And also out of that would provide direction then for the update of specifically the historic overlay section of the land use code.
So all these the code initiatives as well as the neighborhood planning all falls within this one line item that we just talked about. Is that correct?
That is correct. And there's also another initiative, which is $60,000 to scan the plat rooms so that we have all of our recorded subdivision and development plans in a digital format that can then be made accessible to the general public.
Right. That's in there as well. Okay. I believe those are my questions, probably for now, by line item, Chair.
Thank you. Councilor Romero-Worth.
In your reorganization, can you talk a little bit about the compliance office? And I'm specifically wondering about the short-term rental enforcement and how that, I assume that will come out of that office. Is that
That is correct. Councilor Romero-Worth, Mr. Chairman, and members of the committee. So the compliance division is a merging of the short-term rental staff as well as the current enforcement staff that have previously been in the inspection and enforcement division. And there is new leadership being provided with the reassignment of Mr. Smith to head up that division. And the primary purpose behind that is that there had been a lack of coordination between the city attorney's office and that division in terms of preparing cases and getting them ready for prosecution if necessary. But also, we're moving into a very complex technical world where the information that we need to be successful in prosecuting violations is largely in the internet and the cloud and not physically seen on the street. So approaching code enforcement with staff, driving down the street and trying to collect information works in some regards, especially in things like non-permitted construction, but when it comes to use issues, especially short-term rentals, we really need to go to the cloud and collect the information there. So in addition to adding the additional resource of Mr. Smith for that group, we also have released on Monday an RFP for new services for short-term rental compliance. And we've got $60,000 allocated currently. If we're able to find additional funding, we have the option of doing a contract amendment, bringing that before the governing body to add additional services. So there are some services that potentially Mr. Randall would be interested in, such as auditing collection of lodger's tax. These services can also provide a 24/7 hotline. They can provide better communication materials for the public to help them be in compliance. So those are additional ad services that if we're able to look at salary savings and other budget adjustments, we might be able to fund those depending on the costs.
How do you see this compliance division dividing its time? I mean, how do you make sure that they're not too heavy in one area, maybe unpermitted construction, and not keeping their eye on the ball of short-term rentals? How does that manager figure out how the time is allocated?
Thank you for that question, Councilor Romero-Worth, Mr. Chairman, and members of the committee. That really is largely going to also tie into whatever replaces our CRM system, because that is the tool that we use to track complaints coming in. Right now, the way that system currently works it doesn't provide, there's not a real workflow, and there's not an easy way to search and assign tasks. I mean, you do assign responsibility to a call to an individual, but it's not the same as a permitting type of workflow. And I know that the head of constituent services is currently looking at a replacement product for our current system, and that will be a huge help to us. I think once we get the contract executed for the code compliance, you're going to see very little work required from staff other than preparing cases to go to prosecution, and that's where the manager of that division will come in.
Yeah, and I guess, that's, the CRM system's great for complaint-driven things, but I think in order to be successful, we're going to have to enforce without having a complaint, but just have the tools we need, like the scraping software, and so that we're proactive and not just reactive. So, and I guess that'll be a challenge for that division director to really make sure that we're enforcing our rules across the board and paying attention to a proper balance, not getting too heavy in one area and to the detriment of another. So, just, I don't know, prophecy. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think I'm done.
Councilor Rivera.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Continuing on that, your predecessors took on a lot more in the department and really never asked for, I think, the proper amount of staff to really deal with it. Do you, in reality, need more staff, or do you think this reorganization is going to be able to handle all the compliance issues you have to deal with?
Excuse me, Councilor Rivera, you're specifically speaking to enforcement or just the total operations for the department?
Primarily enforcement.
I guess I would respond to that question saying that having a more systematic approach to code enforcement, being proactive and dividing the city up into logical zones and essentially assigning beats to the staff that we have would be the best way of approaching code enforcement in a systematic fashion. The real breakdown I've seen has really been in the disconnect between the city attorney's office and the Planning and Land Use Department in preparing cases for prosecution, and also where we've taken cases for prosecution. By going to district court is a criminal offense, and so if there is a judgment or a settlement, that only has a life, and if there's conditions associated with that, those expire within a year. So we have a current case that went to court, there was a settlement, and I think staff were under the assumption that it was almost like conditions of approval, that those conditions would live forever on that property and we'd be able to force against those. And we were advised by the city attorney's office that those expired in a year. So now we have to start this case all over again. However, if we went, it was municipal court is civil, I'm sorry. If we went to district court, then it would be a different settlement, and those conditions would live in perpetuity and be recorded against the property. So we worked out some of those details, and as the city attorney's office is coming up to staff, I know she's got 2 new hires coming on board. That's been kind of the missing link, in my opinion, is that coordination.
Okay. When you talk about beats, you're talking about having people through all hours of the night or a certain time, or?
I think unless we wanted to significantly expand the department and provide overtime, then we would be looking at just normal business hours. If we wanted to do weekends in order to address noise complaints, as well as after normal business hours, then that would be a significant additional cost. I do know that the city in general doesn't have the most, and I just found this out after we put our budget together, that the city doesn't have the latest technology in terms of like noise meters and those type of devices that would help us. We're in a conversation with the city attorney's office because there are now highly sophisticated apps you can get on your phone that record and can geo-reference, geotag the recording. That would those be admissible in court, because that's really the best, our best solution to those kind of temporary type of issues like barking dogs and other noise complaints, is if a resident can record that on a pre-approved app email that to us. It's date stamped, it's geo-stamped, so we know where they're recording from. If those are admissible in court, then I think we'd be a lot more successful.
I agree, that would be extremely helpful, so I'll be looking forward to that. With regards to the long-range planning, do you know if there are any requirements regarding impact fees and having that position filled?
Thank you, Councilor Rivera, and Chairman and members of the committee. We're actually adding an engineer position to the engineering division, and we think that's the most appropriate position to oversee impact fees. There is a requirement that the impact fees study be updated every 5 years. Catherine Mortimer was helping us with that project before she transitioned back to environmental services, and a consultant has been selected, but we've chosen to not initiate that project until that position's been filled. So as soon as the new fiscal year begins, we'll be able to fill that position, and it was just a question about whether or not land use versus public work was the best place for that position to be housed. I think the coordination focus of the land use department is a better fit, and that new engineering position would allow us to really get on top of that. That was I would say, the biggest hole that was left when Mr. Limey retired from the city a year ago.
Yeah, that's one of them. The other one, and I spoke to the city manager about this, is that Trends magazine, with, not magazine, but the publication he put out that gave a lot of great information about the city, where we were going. Each department, or most of the departments, were outlined in there. So would that be part of this, the responsibility for this person?
Councilor Rivera and members of the committee, actually, and I haven't discussed this with Mr. Brown, I know he's in the audience, that really is more of an economic development function. The city had, and Mr. Liming was responsible for this, had negotiated with Bieber at UNM to build a dashboard for us, and we had got about 1 year's worth of data put into that dashboard. However, the contract or the purchase order for subsequent years wasn't processed. So economic development is currently looking at whether or not Bieber is actually the best source for that kind of data for the city, and whether there are other sources out there that might be able to provide more granular data, and as well as broader set of data for the city to do its decision making.
So that had nothing to do with a collection of impact fees or?
It did not.
Magazine, okay. Very good, thank you. That's all I have, Mr. Chair.
Councilor Vihil-Coppler.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First, I'll ask about the fees. Is there anywhere in here which says what your recommended fee structure is going to be?
We've actually developed that, Councilor Vihil-Coppler, and we didn't provide the detail in the budget packet. So staff has done a detailed analysis of, and primarily using Santa Fe County as a comparison. And so where Santa Fe County is charging for a fee, we're using that as a benchmark for ourselves. But we also went through the list of fees and looked at whether those services were required or optional, as set forth as a process that's already set forth in the land use code.
So is it your understanding if we approve this budget, we're approving fee increases?
That is not correct. There's a separate ordinance that, with all that detail, that would be presented to the governing body.
Okay, and when would that be?
We're in the process of filing those fees right now. It would be a coordination in terms of what would be the most appropriate hearing date to put that before the governing body. It would require a public hearing.
And so in your budget request, you don't have any fee increase structure built in?
It is, actually. We have $500,000 in additional revenue. However, because we're not an enterprise fund, it's not specifically showing up as increased revenue for the land use department.
Well, that was my question too, is how, if we're collecting fees, how is there not any enterprise fund guideline on, you collect fees and then you usually have to spend them on the same type of reason that you collect them, or how would that work?
Mr. Chairman, Councilor Villarreal, or Councilor Vihil-Coppler, sorry.
I'm
Different.
going to charge $1 every time somebody does that.
The V.
I'm worth a lot more, Mr. Mayor.
Yeah. The short answer is different organizations' chart of accounts are structured differently. So the way ours is structured, the majority of the fees collected for land use purposes are attributed to the general fund. There are varying complexities given our very complex chart of accounts. I think the true enterprise funds that you just saw with the Public Utilities Department, where the revenues being brought in actually exceed the expenses for the operating expenses, and they use the fund balances, the cash balances to support a capital plan, is probably the most simple example of an enterprise fund. There are several quote-unquote enterprise funds that the city of Santa Fe has that are not true enterprise funds. For example, the MRC fund or some of the other Parks and Rec funds are deemed enterprise funds, but let's see, what was a good example from yesterday in Public Works, the parking fund, where they receive a general fund subsidy. So these are areas that we will be looking into in future years. Again, the idea would be our goal would be to have a simplified chart of accounts with less funds and more of the funding sources being deposited into the general fund to support general purposes throughout the city. So things are not earmarked to a specific purpose. That will take a few years to get to that goal. One of the main goals that we have with the implementation of the new ERP system is to simplify that chart of accounts and to reduce the number of funds that we have from over 400 down to under 100.
So I thought I heard that part of this budget request includes fee increases, part of it. And we don't have those fee increases in front of us yet.
Mr. Chairman, Councilor Vihil-Coppler, yes, that is correct. So the increase of $500,000, which is a conservative estimate given the fees that are being proposed for one fiscal year, are accounted for in the general fund that we reviewed on the first day of the budget hearings in the overview presentation.
Well, I think it's probably a good idea to know what fee increases we are maybe going to approve that we don't even know what they are. I don't feel that that's transparent, and I want to know who we're going to charge what. If one of my constituents goes into planning and land use and says, "Hey, I just want you to give me an overview of point me to the direction of the ordinances or requirements for putting a bathroom in," would I pay for that advice when I walk in there?
Mr. Chairman, Councilor Vihil-Coppler, we can print out the schedule of proposed fee increases that Director Johnson referenced. You just give us a few minutes and we can review that with you.
Well,
I can just go over in general,
no,
Councilor.
I don't want to know them in general. I want a list. I really think this is, I don't know.
Okay, I understand
I can get that.
Councilor Vihil-Coppler's concern, but I think it's kind of a chicken or egg type thing. It's like, do you do the fees first and then the budget, or do you do the budget first and then the fees? And I think because of timing, I mean, we would have had to have started the fee increase process right 6 months ago or a year ago, potentially. So I guess the question is, if, say we approve the budget, and the governing body approves it, but then we deny the fees or change the fees 2 months later, we would adjust the budget, I guess, because the budget doesn't go into effect till July 1st.
Mr. Chairman, that is correct. So
We have to approve the budget. We can't wait for the fees because we won't make our deadline in May if we...
Mr. Chairman, that is correct. In the scenario where the governing body did not approve the ordinance to change the fee structure, we would then not hire for the positions that are being proposed. and we could forego additional expenses that would be tied to that fee increase.
Well, I find this a little bit backwards, and I see. I just don't like doing business this way, and I know we've played catch up all along, but I think we need to understand where we are in reality here, because this is really not a prudent way to, I don't think, to do business, so to speak. I'm not comfortable with allowing a budget to go forward without seeing in front of me what these fees are, and either having an opportunity to agree or disagree or find new ways to do it. That's how you plan for budgets and how you set your policy as an organization, which is what our role is. So I don't have a vote at this committee, but I do in the future. So I'll just leave it right there and let the chair decide how he would like to handle that. But I think it's important to know that, and for this body to know that there are hidden fee increases in this budget request.
Mr. Chairman, Councilor Villahel-Coppler, ask and you shall receive. In front of you now, you have the schedule of fee increases that we are prepared to review with you today. These are, not hidden fees. These are fees that are in the schedule that are in front of you. We are available for any questions. I think Director Johnson can give you an overview of what is being presented on this two-page sheet.
Okay, we're going to take a timeout on fees for now. Do you
Okay.
have any other questions regarding the rest of the land use
I
budget?
have questions about the organizational chart, and so I see it's kind of hard to compare what's now to what you're proposing, and I'm curious, but maybe you can just tell me, where are the assistant director positions coming from? Are those new positions being requested?
Thank you, Councilor Villahel-Coppler, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Those are reclassifications of 2 vacant positions. There are 2 additional positions that were budgeted by my predecessor for the short-term rental program that were never filled. So with salary
Okay, so how, if you go to the short-term rental page on the what is now, is that the short-term rental lead worker? Those are the positions, right?
The short-term rental staff are currently in the administrative.
Starting with James Martinez, is that short-term rentals?
Yes. Are you referring to the organization?
What is?
chart?
Yeah.
Yeah, the existing, the back.
Right. So there are 2 ordinance enforcement specialist positions that were located, shown at the very bottom, that both indicate as being vacant. Those are the 2 positions that were reclassified. We also chose to reprogram salary savings from a vacant zoning inspection supervisor position. And the combination of those 3 positions is what allowed us to create the 2 assistant director positions.
Okay. Having worked as a realtor, I thought there was always only 4 positions in short-term rental.
As we went through the position control, we identified that there were 2 positions that had been budgeted and funded that had never been filled.
In short-term rental?
Correct.
I think I recall that from last year's budget. Yeah.
So, and
You're
I
right.
thought we had a problem with our review and enforcement of short-term rentals in this city. And so we're taking those positions and moving them into manager positions?
Right, and I think you explained that. Councilor Romero-Worth asked that specific question, and you explained that.
I explained the correct, because we're not able to collect the evidence we need by having officers out in the field.
Right.
The evidence is in the internet, and having a short-term compliance monitoring contract for $60,000 a year that doesn't accrue any benefits or additional medical expenses is a much more effective, as well as cost, from both a cost perspective as well as a results approach to monitoring short-term rentals.
Okay, I also have questions about how you will assure fairness there's a lot of reorganization going on here. And it's hard, are those the only two positions? No, what positions are you requesting? I guess maybe I'll start there.
Thank you, Councilor Vihel-Coppler. And Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. So the assistant directors are being created by reclassifications. Those are no cost impact to the current maintenance budget.
Okay, and before you move on, because this is a lot of information, and I know when you were presenting, I was almost going to ask the chair to ask you to just slow it down a notch, because I was like, whoa. So pardon my questioning, because I didn't follow everything you said.
Okay.
I want to make sure. So on those two, when you say reclassifications, will those be hand-picked people, or are you going to offer, how is that going to, and maybe that question applies to all the other changes. And I'm coming from a point of equity and fairness.
Certainly.
To employees. So how will you make that determination?
These are new vacancies. They go through a posting process, a selection process like any new vacancy would be in the organization.
All right. And then do you have other new positions?
The other new positions mentioned were a junior engineer for the engineering division. And this one is essential because right now we just have one other engineer in the land use department, and we want to avoid the problem that we've had for the last 9 months before Mr. Schiavo joined our organization of not having anyone trained and with the appropriate certifications to be able to step into that leadership position over time.
And is that engineer included in this number 7?
Yes, it
you
is.
have here?
Mm-hmm.
So your one position
It's the second.
engineering?
It's the second. Mr. Schiavo is the city engineer, and this new position is the bullet just under that.
City engineer.
Mr. Schiavo is the city engineer, and the new position is the engineer position that just says engineer directly underneath that.
Okay, so that's 6 positions there. So are you counting the little box engineer?
There are
as
2
one
planner
position?
technicians.
Oh, okay, there you go. Got it. All right. So that's a new position you're requesting.
Correct.
All right. And then?
The transportation position, a transportation planner, is the one just below that.
Under the same box?
Same box, immediately underneath engineer.
Okay. So the transportation planner, so those 2 positions you're requesting in engineering.
Correct. And then one additional position under the building box.
Right.
So it's the third from the bottom, construction plans examiner 4.
Okay.
Currently, complicated plans like plumbing, electrical, and mechanical are reviewed by the supervisors for those trades. So the supervisors are splitting their time between plan review, conducting inspections, and supervising staff. By adding this additional position with these additional certifications, we'll be able to reduce the load on the inspection supervisors, and so that they'll be able to be out in the field more regularly and provide closer supervision to their staff. So it'll expand our capacity both from a building plan turnaround standpoint as well as an inspection standpoint.
So that's 3 positions.
No, that the total new positions are 3.
Okay, yeah. All right. Are any of these new classifications that you're requesting, or are they within our existing structure?
They're within our existing set of classifications.
Okay, so these assistant directors, though, you're recommending they be reclassified, and have they been assigned salary ranges?
They have.
Okay. And what are they?
They're commensurate with the assistant director for human resources.
Okay, and those job descriptions, have they already been created?
Yes.
Okay. All right, so no other reclasses are being done in the department?
Not at this time.
Okay. I thought there was somebody that was moved up into the director's office. Has that position been reclassified?
There was a project administrator that was moved from current planning into the director's office, and that was because that position is overseeing trust accounts and other things that go beyond the current planning division.
So that's LU project administrator.
Administrator,
Okay,
correct.
has that job description been created?
It's an existing job. It's an existing position. It's an existing classification, and it's a filled position. It was reassigning a person from one business unit to the other.
Was that offered to anybody, or that was just specific? I mean,
The person was, it was just changing supervisory assignments. It was not a new position. It was not a reclassification. It was reassigning a person, an existing staff person, from one supervisor to another.
okay, and I ask these questions because there's a lot going on here, and I just, a lot of reclassifications, and when that kind of thing happens, there's concern, and there's concern for fairness and equity. And if we can maintain that, I'm okay with it. But if we don't maintain it, then, creates other issues. So those are all my questions, Mr. Chair.
Councilor Villarreal.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On that point, I didn't actually realize there was a backside, so that helped to have Councilor Villarreal over there, Councilor Vigil Koppler. I was just curious about also the name changes or reassignments. They're confusing because when you try to compare what's under director, some of them they correlate with other positions on the other side, and then the others don't. So I guess I was just eventually, hopefully we'll know who those people are and what their roles are. Because all of these, with the exception of maybe a couple, I don't know who and what they are, like contracts administrator, land use project administrator, property manager. Is that within the old
No. So if I could respond to that, Councilor Villarreal, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. So the land use property manager is Ed Vigil, who was reassigned to land use.
Great.
The land use project administrator is Geraldine Gourlay. The contracts administrator is a vacant position. The land use project manager, we just yesterday reclassified that to a business analyst so that we could find a candidate. We were struggling finding a candidate that met the requirements for a project manager, and that position specifically for the EnerGov/ERP. And then Amanda Insinius, who is here, is our administrative manager.
Okay. So the
Chair,
business
Mr. Chair,
analyst
on that point.
is the ERP.
Correct.
Okay.
May I request that we get this with the names? 'Cause
Certainly.
it's hard to keep writing all this down.
Did you,
Thank you.
Councilor Villarreal, did you want her to name everybody in her department?
Not necessarily. I was just trying to understand how people were moving over to different reassignments, and so we know where to go. And I think it would actually help to know, for our sake. Well, I think obviously constituent services and our counselor liaisons would have a better sense of who to go to. But it would just help if we had questions who we go to. That would be helpful. So that was my question about ERP. There is an ERP that was hired. Is that correct?
It was just posted yesterday.
Oh, okay. So that's still. And the contracts administrator will be filled?
Correct.
Okay. So that is actually another position.
That, excuse me, if I could respond to that. The contract administrator position is a reclassification of an administrative secretary that was assigned to the director previously and has been vacant.
Okay. Thank you. So the compliance division, let's see, where is that? Okay. Planning manager, zoning enforcement. So that's short-term rentals, right?
Correct.
That's current enforcement and code compliance, all under that.
Mm-hmm.
And there's 8. Okay. So I guess my question also had to do with the logic around long-range planning and eliminating that position. I guess I always thought of the long-range planner as someone that would actually end up being the updating Chapter 14, any updates to the general plan, which we have not done. So my concern, and I guess my question to you is, I know you had budgeted to do the Chapter 14 updates, but hasn't been a conversation about any sections of the general plan that needs updating. And in the past, we've had conversations that some sections in there are still valid. They're still some of the value statements that we believe in, but there's other sections that do need updating. So does that fold into this plan of, I know it's not necessarily connected to Chapter 14, but there are connections in terms of how we see us moving forward as a city. So is there a plan for sections of the general plan to be updated?
Thank you for that question, Councilor Villarreal, Chairman and members of the committee. If you actually go to our FY20 goals for the department, there is, we have citywide 3-year goals. It's on the second page of my handout at least. And year 1, which is the year we would be moving into, consists of developing guiding principles, and this is establishing the framework for the long-range land use plans and regulation, and then also phase 1 of the land use code update. And in terms, to answer your question about long-range planning, the division prior to the retirement of Mr. Liming and Mr. McPherson only consisted of 2 individuals, which is really insufficient to do the scope of work that was necessary. Mr. Liming's division director position was reclassified in order for us to be able to elevate the position, the head of the Historic Preservation Division. Mr. McPherson's position is being added to the planning division, and those planners will be doing both current planning and long-range planning. In consulting with the staff, they all expressed a very strong interest in doing long-range planning. And so in order not to deprive anyone of that opportunity, they're going to have blended assignments. Well, they'll be doing current planning as well as long-range planning. And the intent is when the assistant director over planning is hired, we'd be developing basically a work matrix, a work plan that identifies which planners are the lead for the various projects that we've identified. And then there may be some planners that do more exclusively current planning, some that do more exclusively long-range planning, but there are not enough positions to create a whole separate division.
Okay. So it's not going away, it's being folded into
Correct.
Current planner roles.
That's correct.
Okay. So regarding the general plan then,
Mhm.
does that fit into long-range planners and also the update to the
So the first,
14?
if you go again to the citywide 3-year goals, the first year is developing the guiding principle or the planning framework.
Okay.
Year 2 is when we actually get into the details of the neighborhood planning program. Some of this has been a little bit on hold, waiting for the neighborhood position to be filled in constituent services and understanding what resources would we be able to gain from that position. There are significant portions of the city where there's no established or identified neighborhood organization. So the first thing we need to do is fill in those blanks and then develop consistent standards in terms of how those neighborhoods are going to operate. So there's a great deal of organizational capacity that needs to be developed at the neighborhood level first, and then that'll guide our decision about how we develop the latter years of that work program for updating the general plan.
That sounds great. I forgot you all call it guiding principles, so yes. All right. And then the other question, too many papers around here. So within the code update realm is the update to the escarpment?
It's all of Chapter 14, so that would include all the overlay districts, including the escarpment districts. It will also spend a significant amount of time looking at our processes. I know there's been a lot of interest in updating the early neighborhood notification process, so that will be part of the scope of work as well.
Excellent. So the those updates, remind me, that's internal. You won't be hiring contractual?
No, we will.
You will. That was the amount that we talked about yesterday?
Mm-hmm.
That's all for contractual, or what was it, 377? Okay, I get it.
The 377 is several different contracts, but the amount allocated for both the guiding principles and the first phase of the land use code update would be $225,000.
200. Okay. Thank you. And last piece of this, Will you all be in partnership with Affordable Housing Office working on some sort of analysis for the fee in lieu of, since it'll be expiring this year?
Absolutely.
Okay. So is there a timeline for that?
Ms. Ladd is here. She's the director of that office and that project.
Okay, great. I think that's all I have.
Mr. Lindell.
Okay, we're into the second round, right? Oh, it seemed like we kind of edged into there a little bit, but I just have a couple of questions. First of all, I just want to say how happy I am with the changes in planning and land use department. Thank you very much, the staff and you, Ms. Johnson. It's been a pretty magnificent turnaround from where I sit, and I'm really, really appreciative of it. You've really done a terrific job, and I think that the people that work in that department work so hard, and that they've done a terrific job. And I know that this reorganization, these kinds of things don't just serve the citizens in the city. I think once we can get this type of thing implemented, which I know it takes effort and it's a lot of change, and I always say there's two things people don't like: the way things are now and change. So it'll be an effort, but nonetheless, I have a real trust in you that this organizational change will be good for all of us, and also for employees, even though it does take some effort to change. With that said, I just have a couple of very, very minor things that I wanted to ask about. In the fiscal year 20 goals, there was the code compliance division with a 80% complaint investigations within 3 days. I think that that's a great goal, and I just want you to know that I think people really appreciate that. That's really the face of us in the community a lot of times, and it makes a big difference. So I hope we can do that. I think it's a big deal. The second thing that I just put a little star beside is under the fiscal year 20 goals, Historic Preservation Division, providing training for HPD staff on code requirements and adopted policies and procedure. I would ask that training also be extended to the board. I think that it's I think we ought to have a board that is extremely well intended. They do that job as volunteers and out of love and care for the city and our historic districts. But I think that some of the appeals that we see sometimes, that we all need to try to get closer to the same page. I know there's a lot of interpretation, but I would ask that with that training, that it also be extended to the board. So those are the only comments that I have, and I'm very, very appreciative to the entire land use staff.
Councilor Harris.
Thank you, Chair. Similar to Councilor Lindell, I expressed a little bit differently as kind of a leap of faith on the reorganization. Clearly it's been needed, and so I was not very critical or asking very critical questions. But I have to say, and this was also on my list, and I'd highlighted it, you clearly say the updated fee proposal included in the FY20 recommended budget. So you're acknowledging a fee proposal, and it is, I also agree with, to a certain extent, Councilor Vigil-Koppler, that it's been good to get out ahead of this, and really, so the leap of faith really runs, two ways. When I use that phrase, it's on the reorganization, be able to pull it off, and really makes real strides in planning and land use. But it also is clearly dependent, and I'd also had realized that the fees, or knew that the fees were going to go into the general fund. So I look at that line item, it's $1 million increase. The proposed fees is $730,000, call it 30, that 7,000. And so you're kind of at risk. And to have to dial it back, it seems to me to be problematic. Ms. McCoy?
Mr. Chairman, I think the schedule before you shows the $732,000 estimate for these proposed fees.
Right.
What we have actually included in our general fund projections for these fees is an increase of $500,000. So ahead of actually knowing what this amount will be, we are confident in the $700,000 number that was provided by Director Johnson and her staff. But in an effort to be conservative, we have only included an additional $500,000, not the $700,000 projection.
Against this $1 million increase in general fund that's shown here.
Mr. Chairman, Councilor Harris, yes, that is correct. There is a total of $1 million additional in the planning and land use budget.
In the general fund, correct.
And again,
so half of that is dependent upon this fee increase. But it's still, you know, I appreciate the fact that you have discounted it essentially from 737 to 500. It's still a little bit of a leap of faith. So we'll hopefully see that before too long, before you get too far into reorganization and those types of things.
On that point,
Of course.
It's all right. What is the timing on the fee? You said it's going to come before council. Do you have a sense of, is that when?
Well, the intent is to get it to you before the end of the fiscal year, if at all possible. We just have some minor refinements to do that fee. There will be a delay in implementation, however, because of our InterGov project. So some of those fees that are existing where there's a minor increase proposed, that's a relatively easy reprogramming effort. However, if it's a brand new fee, it's not programmed into that system at all yet, and so there would be some delay in implementing those, and that was part of the justification of being very conservative and reducing the number from the 700,000 figure down to 500,000.
And when you say delay, what do you mean by that? 6 months, a month,
Oh, no,
2 weeks?
a couple months. So
Yeah.
I would say September timeframe. And it also provides us with the opportunity of letting the community know that we're proposing the fee increase and giving enough lead time for the effective date of those fees so that they can account for them in their project.
Okay, thank you.
Okay,
Thank you,
yeah, of course. Moving on, and actually, this was one of my general questions as well, something I've been concerned about for quite a while. You've rephrased it as tracking of trust accounts. My observation is, my opinion is, really hadn't been very clear about how that money's come in, remained, flowed out, and how much is there. So that whether the bonds associated with projects or trust accounts or any number of things, to know that we're actually really getting on top of this, really has a clear mandate. I think was the land use. It's under your directorship.
Correct.
Be the land use project administrator. Was
Correct.
that what I heard? Okay. Well, that's very good. Another thing that I've observed, and this is out of Las Saleras, and I think perhaps you're trying to respond to it in goals, advanced performance, creating cross-functional teams to work on projects to reduce conflict, improve performance. And I don't know if the cross-functional team is internal, but I'm going to use the example of Las Saleras Regional Park, which you got a lot of attention when I was on the Planning Commission about how it was going to be developed. Went through phase one of Pulte's work, started to address it. There's real issues. So I don't think there was a cross-functional team between land use, parks and recreation, and public works to really make sure we got what we thought we were going to get, because at this point we are not getting what we thought we were going to get. And it's a big, kind of a black mark.
Councilor Harris, Chairman and members of the committee, that is very true. I've spoken to members of the community about this as well that had extensive conversations with previous leadership in parks and thought that their concerns, their issues, their design input had been taken in and codified in some manner so that it would be able to be carried on, communicated to other staff, and it would be implemented. And there was clearly a significant breakdown between parks and land use because the design features, the standards that the community had requested were not communicated to us. I know staff that were here that were involved in that project tried to do their best to fill that vacuum and made calls that might now be inconsistent with what the community thought that they were going to get.
But it's even more than that, too, because, so for instance, the work, the ground, the acreage associated with Phase 2 and Phase 3, which really had, all of that had a lot of tree coverage, has been pretty much demolished, a significant portion of it. So this really needs to be much, much better than it has been in the past for me to be satisfied. So you've listed it, so to me you acknowledge it's an issue, and good luck. Nuisance ordinance. To what degree, when we heard from the city attorney's office, we looked at different initiatives that they're looking at, nuisance ordinance, and this is something that probably all districts deal with, certainly in District 4 we are, but what kind of input, and you mentioned noise. I've been out, adjacent to a party barn, quite frankly. So what kind of input are you going to provide on the nuisance ordinance? And is it departmentally, or is your director, do you have an opinion on this? Are we too loose? Are we too tight? How do we enforce?
The nuisance, addressing nuisance complaints is probably one of the most difficult things to deal with in city government, just because they happen at a certain point of time and usually outside of normal business hours when we have staff available to respond, or even if it is during business hours, by the time staff gets out to where the situation is happening, it's too late. The issue, the nuisance has moved on, and we aren't able to collect the information, the evidence that we need in order to pursue enforcement. So that is where the conversation is going to be happening with the city attorney's office, is in pushing the envelope on how can we help our residents collect the information that we need that will stand up in court so that we can prosecute these violations. Basically, yeah, helping our residents be more successful in getting along and making people aware what the regulations are and what the consequences are.
Well, once again, good luck on that one. So last general question. This has to do within the planning function of your department. I think there's a reference, the phrase, I won't search around, but kind of improve processes, complete streamlining of processes and procedures. Number of new procedures created. I don't really know what that means. I mean, it's almost contradictory. If we're going to streamline of processes and procedures, but then it goes on to say number of new procedures created.
That would be the measure. So the first is the target, and before the backslash, and then the second phrase is the measure. So we would be creating an inventory of our procedures, and then the number of those, or percentage of the total, that are improved would be the measure of success.
So you telling me number of improvement to existing procedures, or
Correct.
are we really going to? It almost reads like we're going to create a batch of new procedures, which I don't think anybody really looks forward to.
No, that's not our intent. It's to improve existing procedures, and we're going to be going through a learning and growing phase as we implement EnerGov, because unlike the Munis and the HR modules of the ERP system, those are more pre-programmed, if you will. They're out of the box. Because land use rules change from jurisdiction to jurisdiction so much, there's a lot of more customized workflows that were developed for the EnerGov module of the ERP program. And so we have to, while we're testing them, it was not Tyler Systems business practice to give us and after. We did the pre-workflows, the existing workflows, but we didn't get a post-design workflow for us to be able to compare against. So
It's odd.
it is odd, and it's been a huge point of frustration and a significant reason for needing this business analyst to go through and then map out the to-be, the future scenario, the processes that we will be using, and then there's going to be a bit of adjustment that has to happen with staff. We may be within their job classifications, but doing some minor adjustments to people's day-to-day job duties to better utilize the tool.
All right. Those are my questions, Chair. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Johnson.
Just one last question, Ms. Johnson. The transportation planner under the MPO, and this is under your new proposal, and the transportation planner under engineering, what's the difference between the two, and can they do both jobs?
I'm going to ask Mr. Ani to come up and address that question. There's a because of the MPO is funded by federal funds, there's a specific limit on how localized the activities can be.
Is that position funded from federal funds?
In the MPO division, yes, but not in the engineering division.
Okay, then that answers my question. That's fine. With that, I'll move for approval of the planning and land use.
Okay, we have a motion. Can we have a second? Okay. Do you want to get this approved right now, Mayor? Or you want to? Okay, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, motion carries. Thank you. Okay, we're going to move on to, thank you, exactly. Office of Affordable Housing. The Office of Affordable Housing. Let me make sure I have the right file. Okay. Welcome, Ms. Ladd. We've got taking a look at your budget. Overall, it's a decrease of 3%. But there is a increase in transfer to other funds. There's not much with salary, wages, and benefits. So go ahead and just kind of give us a quick overview of what you're proposing in your budget, and then I'll turn to questions from the committee.
Thank you, Chair, members of the committee. The decrease that you see is actually a reflection of the fact that our accounting, my understanding, and Jessica, please correct me if I'm wrong, when we account for our federal grant, we have to enter each project in as its own line item, and so business unit. So it shows up as a project on the budget, and because our accounting system doesn't allow us to just show that it's drawn down and then it goes away as a project until we load up the budget with the current year project or the next year's projects. The money's already been spent, but it's not carried forward into the new budget as a project because it's completed. So it shows as a reduction in the budget.
Okay.
That makes sense? Late in the day.
Questions from the committee. Councillor Lindell. Councillor Harris. Councillor O'Mara-Worth. Councillor Villarreal. Here, let me.
We're all looking for. I just want to check in the budget numbering. There is an increase of a staff person. Actually, it was an increase. It was a position that had you all were I guess I just remember from all of the budget cuts that you weren't able to fill at the time we did during the budget deficit back in the days. Is that right? There was a position I felt like you all were asked to cut it, but you needed it. It's just that when we were doing budget cuts during that time, that was one of the...
Chair Beta, Councilor Villarreal, I believe that was several years ago, so we've existed without that position filled. This position that we are putting into, or asking to be approved into next year's budget is an existing position within the city. It was not an existing position within our budget.
Okay. But it was within the city, so it came from...
Yes.
Where did it come from?
Chairman, Councilor Villarreal, as I had briefly mentioned to the committee, I believe in one of the previous days, the intent of to be fiscally responsible is not to increase the headcount, the number of positions throughout the city with this budget. So where possible, we were able to either identify a term position where the funding, as we discussed with the lodger's tax, could potentially decrease in the future, or to reclassify a position from another department, another position that had been vacant for over a year, sometimes over 2 years, in order to not increase the overall head count, the overall position count for the city.
That makes sense. And that position, where is it located on the budget? Where does it reflect that?
Chair, Counselor, what's the specific question you're asking?
Well, because there's where's the money coming from? Is that what you said? The new position that we talk about for affordable housing, where is it on the budget?
Currently, that position was in facilities. It did not get moved out of the facilities budget into the affordable housing budget. We do know which position it is. It is 147. It is fully funded in the facilities budget. We will be needing to move that from there to the affordable housing budget, and we will do that before the final budget book is done.
Okay. That's helpful. Now we know why it's not in there. All right. I think, let me look through this. I'm going to pass it over while I look through some other forms.
Mr. Chair, or
Councilor
Ms. Chair.
Romero Worth, did you want to go ahead?
Well, can somebody get me a copy of the spreadsheets? I have this part, but I don't have this part.
Here.
Yeah. Well, I'm borrowing Councilor Harris's.
Councilor Harris, did you have an opportunity to ask questions?
Thank you, Chair. I think I'm ready now. Couple questions on page 2. Subsidy payments go up almost 200%. Can you provide some detail on that, please?
Certainly, Chair Beta, Councilor Harris. This is the big programmatic increase that I'm requesting. What this will do is fund in full the rental assistance requests that we were not able to fund through our Affordable Housing Trust Fund cycle because we simply did not have enough funds that we were able to use for rental assistance. And because we know what an emerging need that is in this community, I'm requesting the increase to come from general funds so that we can create fee-for-services contracts through which the rental assistance will be administered. What I really like about the applications we got for the trust fund was that the different groups were all representing very specific different populations in the community with very severe affordability needs for rental housing.
Just that again?
It's on page 2. I think it's about it's the second line item.
Thank you.
Page 2. And, you operate in a very complex world in terms of regulations and funding streams and how it gets divvied up. I do appreciate that part of what you do very much. But my observation, it seemed like rental assistance is one of those initiatives, one of those measures that we take that really probably leverage quite a bit in terms of, immediacy, getting housing in place through rental assistance if they're right on the edge. So I don't know too much more than that, but that answers my question. And then on the other line item I had a question on would be on page 3. That's grants and services. Assume this might be something we've just been shifting around because we didn't have anything under this line item until this year. Now we're $560,000. This would be, again, on page 3, probably about 10 items down, something like that. You want to talk?
Yes, Chair Abeyta, Councilor Harris. Sorry, the reading glasses, and then I'm having a hard time. That line item is actually the amount of the community development block grant that we are going to use for the projects for the upcoming year.
Right.
And it's a placeholder because at the time that we initially pull the budget together, we don't have the business unit and line items for the specific projects because of the somewhat inability to sync the city's accounting system with HUD's accounting system. We have to keep the flow of cash very, very segregated in that way by using the individual line items. So until we know those, they're all lumped into that one placeholder line item. The other projects you see down here that are that are line itemed out, those are the current year projects. So after the year starts, we do a budget adjustment to put each contract into a separate line item with the appropriate amount. So that's why these are all zeroed out this year because we have new projects coming online, so these don't carry forward.
Okay. So basically, even the community block development grants, even though we've gotten them in years past because of the accounting system, we're showing a projection at 560, and then on the next page, I guess, where it's got grants and services, for the most part, they're bracketed figures, kind of represents the actuals from the previous year. I didn't quite understand. Because they don't have anything in there for 20.
Councilor Harris, if you look at the bottom of page 2, I think it is.
Page 2? Okay.
Let's see, right. Page 2. Page 3.
Okay.
Oh, okay. You'll see the different projects listed and they're identified by the subrecipient. So there's Habitat for Humanity, YouthWorks, the Adelante, Santa Fe Community Housing Trust, et cetera. So those are all this year's projects. So we then have to zero them out for next year's budget because we're going to set up a whole new set of projects.
So I expressed it, and it's actually on it shows up on page 4, but so I tried to give you back your answer to see if I understood it. I think I basically got it, but now pointing out the actually grant recipients and zeroing that out because I noted that they were zeroed out in 20. So I again, complex world in terms of the regulations and the money flow that you operate in. So those are my questions, Chair. Thank you.
Councilor Romero Worth.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On page 2, this expenditure Verde Fund, is this the Verde Fund? And what is this?
Chair Abeyta, members of the Commission, this is the Verde Fund. It was a one-time expenditure that was put into my budget. The funds have been fully expended.
Okay, and there's no money going forward, so we're closing
Correct.
this out. Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair.
On that point. So there were some great aspects to that project, to that initiative. So I'm wondering how that continues, and maybe it looks different, or if it's through the sustainability office, or is this just like completely ending and we're not supporting the entities that made up the team for the Verde Fund, or are we kind of shifting it so that it's supporting overarching kind of sustainability goals?
Councillor Beta, Chair Beta, Councillor Villarreal, all of the two main contractors for that project continue to be supported through various ways by the city. The success of the Verde Fund was that the city funding truly provided seed funding to launch a very successful project, which is now getting funded through, I believe there's some federal, I'm blanking on the name, like job training, youth corps types of federal funding that's now going into the Youth Works program, as well as other workforce development and training funds.
So it was a leveraging effort. They actually got other funding that's continuing their projects and their in the program.
Correct.
Okay. Are they still calling it Verde Fund?
They call it the Verde Community Impact
okay.
Collaborative.
Yeah.
I think that's right.
New name, new funding source, similar. They're still doing the same projects, like the food, nutrition, food security piece, the job training.
Chair Beta, Councillor Villarreal, I believe that they are still focused on the core, the forest thinning, the composting at the community college, the food box delivery, as well as the Youth Works culinary program was part of it as well.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Lindell, did you have any questions? Okay, Councillor Vihil-Coppler.
I don't have questions specifically here, but I do want to ask about a timeline for discussing the program in general, the fee in lieu of and all that stuff.
Chair Beta, Councillor Vihil-Coppler, we've developed the concepts for the amendments. We are going to redline the ordinance in-house first. Then we will workshop it with a group of expert stakeholders. And then we're planning on starting the public comment period in June, and then going through, of course, all of the Planning Commission, all the public hearings for the remainder of the month. So the idea is that anyone who is faced with that deadline of January 1, if they're currently considering a project, they should know by June what the proposed changes look like, and then hopefully they can plan accordingly.
Thank you.
Councillor Villarreal.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to add to what Councillor Harris said about the rental assistance, and you were talking about the impact, I think I've learned from Alex a lot about that aspect. It is something that helps immediate need. It also saves us money in the long run because, as you said, it costs more to rehouse people versus to keep them in the homes. So I think it is a piece of the puzzle, and I'm glad we're funding it separately from the CDBG funding. There was a question I had about the position. The position you're adding, what's the title again?
It's a project specialist position.
And they'll be doing specifically?
Chair Beta, Councillor Villarreal, the concept is that this position will provide support for all the grant administration because, as you know better than anybody, it's a huge, heavy lift. But also just to help us manage our data better, to free up some of my time and the CDBG planner's time to actually do some more of the policy and planning work that we want to do and we're trained to do. So we also really want to expand the way we do public outreach. We did a sample MetroQuest app for the annual action plan, and the company, the MetroQuest company, is actually featuring it on their podcast because they they said, we've never had a local government use it for something like this. This is so cool. But that's hugely time consuming and really takes a lot of organizing and setting up meetings, and we just have never had the capacity to do that well, and so this position will help support that as well.
And they'll be able to help with the MetroQuest if we use it again. Do we have
Correct.
a subscription for that?
We are paying for a subscription to continue the current subscription through the end of the year because we're in the process of still using it. And then I actually believe that it's in our budget for next year, but I'm hoping that it can be used citywide because I think other departments could also take advantage of the tool.
That's it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Is there a motion regarding the Office of Affordable Housing?
Move to approve.
Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Those opposed, motion carries. Okay, so we are coming upon the 4 o'clock hour. I know there's another meeting, I believe, at 5. Do we want to get started on economic development, see how far we go, or what does the committee want to do?
I'm willing to go to 4:30. It would be nice to have a break since we've been sitting here between this and the next meeting.
Mr. Chair, councilors, if it weighs into your decision, I did call Matt Brown. He's on his way over. He hasn't arrived here yet.
Okay, let's take a 5-minute break, and then we'll get started on economic development, and we'll go to 4:30. Let's, we can take a 9-minute break. We'll start at 4 o'clock. 9 minutes.
I mean, cracking the whip is going a little bit too far. 9 minutes. Can we go to the boys' room? Go for it. That's not the worst thing they did. It is. It's a tough read. Yeah. I dropped it. Mayor, I dropped it off to Mary, and I didn't say anything to her except. Did you see that little? ask more questions.
Okay, so let's go ahead and get back into our session. We are on to the Office of Economic Development. Mr. Brown, when I look at the summary of your budget, I don't see much of an increase at all. In fact, there's a slight decrease. So what we're going to do is I'm going to go ahead and just open it up to questions from the committee. And I'm sure through our questions, we'll probably cover anything you were planning to covering anyways. So, Councilor Lindell.
Okay, Chair, we're trying to go on the numbers this first round.
Well, it's
correct?
pretty.
Or are we just
No,
opening
I
it up?
think it's pretty small.
I mean, it's been a free-for-all. I've tried to follow the rules, Chair, and I kind of feel like I got left behind a little bit. So I'm going to free-for-all it, but I'm not going to be long.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, exactly. Hard to
He wants,
believe.
he,
Can't accept it.
he wants me to do it in rap.
Hard to believe you'd be left behind.
Iambic pentameter?
The only thing I'm going to comment on at this point in time is just one small item on your summary on page 4, where it says support entrepreneurship, the ongoing support of FSBI, RDC, and Make Santa Fe. I'd like for us to add SCORE onto that line.
Absolutely happy to do that.
Thank you. I'll pass at this point.
Okay, Council.
Actually,
go ahead, Matt.
If I may, I have to make one amendment to that. The SCORE contract it ends this fiscal year, so we are issuing a new RFP in anticipation of getting approval for the budget. We expect SCORE to apply for that as well as others. So that's why I didn't put ongoing SCORE support, because I would feel like I'd be prejudicing the outcome of the response to that RFP.
Do we have RFPs on these other?
The only two that are requiring an RFP at this time are for the services provided by SCORE and the services provided by Mix and BizMix. So both of which are in draft form in preparation, hopefully, for the budget to be approved. And I believe in the goals, I have it written somewhere. Oh, actually, I had written an amended highlights for this year, but they weren't able to get in at the time, where I clarified that those are the two PSAs that are terminating this fiscal year, and so we have to issue new RFPs.
And then that's going to be the case with SFBI and RDC in another year or two.
I believe for sure SFBI, and I believe maybe Youth Works as well, are both coming due this coming fiscal year.
Okay.
By memory, I don't know RDC.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Councilor Harris.
Probably not. Well, I'll wait. I don't know if I have any money questions to speak of. I had some general questions, so I'll wait till.
Okay, Councilor Romero Worth.
I thought this was a free-for-all.
We'll go back to Councilor Harris.
So, Matt, this broadband and telecom, finalize and adopt city strategy. Is that to get rid of the dead zones that we have? What does that mean? What are you planning there?
Thank you for the question. Yes, and more. So the city currently doesn't have anyone managing broadband and telecommunications strategy on behalf of the city. We have a draft of a plan that Sean Moody was able to work on, but was just sort of derailed once he became interim asset development director. So we want to complete that. In that strategy would be attacking the dead zones, both at the cell coverage level, and also looking at underserved communities where broadband is below the acceptable national standards.
Isn't that all over the city?
It's actually based on the research that Sean did. Despite how we all feel and find dead zones, we are comparable to many other cities. I know it's hard to believe, but
New Mexico cities or cities across the country?
Yeah, cities outside of New Mexico. That doesn't mean that
This
it's
country?
adequate or sufficient for residents and, and people living here just wanting to have like things stream and not buffer and not have phones drop, and let alone for business purposes. So we definitely have to improve that. And this FTE, the leadership there will help us do that, I believe, significantly. In addition, what's not represented here, but we are having conversations with the city manager is leading with the county to look at creating a joint office similar to how we have with the film office, because I believe, and as does Chris Heyer, the economic development director for the county, that working collaboratively, we're going to get a lot better results than working independently. So I'm hopeful that we'll be able to do that as well.
Well, I applaud that and think this is, I'm glad we're doing something to strategically address getting better service in this community. It's very hard functioning. Did I read somewhere that we didn't use all our LEDA money, or am I making that up?
That's correct in that for this fiscal year we had set aside $100,000 in anticipation, because the prior year we were short. We got surprised by, I think, $90,000 worth of investments. We set aside $100,000, of which I used about $13,000 for the Marty's Meals LEDA investment, but there were no other LEDA investments that came through this fiscal year. So we are in the budget now allocating $50,000 set aside for this coming fiscal year. And if we go over and above that, which, knock on wood, if we're fortunate enough to do that, the strategy would be to borrow some money from the Tierra Contenta Fund. So there is some money set aside there that's earmarked for economic development, so it wouldn't be an increase in the budget. We would pull down from the Tierra Contenta Fund.
And how does that work? Do we go looking for them, or do they come looking for us? Or
It's
is
both.
it probably both?
It's both.
Yeah.
And currently, I would say our pipeline is around 5 to 6 companies in the pipeline right now that are viable candidates for LEDA in this coming year.
And why didn't we end up spending it? Did we just didn't have companies that were qualified to
Correct.
receive the funds?
Correct.
Okay. That's all I have for now, Mr. Chair.
Councilor Harris.
Actually, Councilor Romero Worth, and she'll testify that she stole my thunder. I've got 2 notes. One says LEDA, one says broadband. So thank you, Councilor Romero Worth.
All right, Councilor Villarreal.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Those particular items you talked about, like LEDA and then the contracts, where does that show up on the budget sheet?
Oh, thank you for that question. And Brad may get there faster than I will, but
Page 6.
Page 6.
page 6.
And is there a
Actually, on mine it's page 5, so I'm sorry. We may have different printouts, but
What's the title?
the title for the contracts is other consulting. The title for LEDA are grants and services.
LEDA. And then other consulting of the RFPs. So I didn't understand what you meant when you answered Councilor Lindell's question. On your goals, it says ongoing support for SFBI, RDC, and Make Santa Fe, which are contracts.
So those are existing contracts that are coming into their 4th year of existence.
Uh-huh.
So therefore, it would be ongoing. We don't have to issue a new RFP. We're just going to issue the last and final amendment to extend that contract. So
And scores on a different schedule?
correct. So SCORE and BizMix, they were on a different schedule. So their contracts terminate as of June 30th of this year.
Is that also, when you reference YouthWorks, do they have a contract?
Theirs is still ongoing as well.
Ongoing, okay. Thank you for that clarity. And then the job changes is what I'm assuming made the adjustment to, what is it, 200, what's the increase? I just saw it. Now, help, Brad, help.
Yeah.
Where is it? There was a change with staff. Page 5, did you say? Yes, Thank you.
Bless you.
So that means that's the move of asset development into economic development. Is that correct? And then reclassifying, or what does the change signify?
I'll start. You want to start? Go ahead. Please do.
So, yes, asset development was moved out of the city manager's office into economic development. That is the movement of the asset development director. And there's also a reclass of another position to a asset development associate.
And if I may, that is essentially the position that Matt O'Reilly had open for 2 years but didn't fill. So we're, and then it dropped off last budget, so we're
Right.
bringing it back.
So the asset development director, wait, what is it called?
It technically is actually, so Kevin Kellogg is our asset development manager. Has everyone met Kevin? This is
You haven't
Kevin Kellogg,
formally
our new asset
introduced.
development manager. And the title is manager. It used to be a director.
Okay.
And then the new position that we're proposing is asset development associate. So there'd be two people working full-time on what our director of finances said is roughly $1 billion worth of assets. So we think that two people working on that would double or triple our output. So that's us.
So Ed Vigil will no longer be that associate. I don't know if that was his title, but
So his title is different. He's moving over into
To
land
land
use,
use.
but we'll still be working closely with asset development, but doing that out of land use. He seemed to be spending 50% or more of his time in land use anyway. So the recommendation from both Ed and from Sean Moody was that he'd be more naturally fit inside of land use. So we agreed to that.
so the associate will be posted, or it is already?
It's not posted until it gets approved.
Okay, so that's in process. Got it. I think that's all I have for now. Thank you.
Counselor Vigil Koppler.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the contract for BizMix was on its last renewal. Is that right?
Correct. It terminates June 30th.
Okay. And will the Chamber of Commerce be picking up that program and that responsibility? Do you know?
My understanding is they already have. It's already a part of the chamber. And
Well, I know it's part of the chamber because we moved the contract over there. But are they going to continue? Because they will no longer be getting those funds from us.
correct. So we will issue an RFP. I anticipate that the chamber representing BizMix will be one of the respondents to the RFP. I don't know who else will respond.
Okay, so what RFP is that?
We are proposing in the budget to have money set aside, in this case $50,000, for business accelerator and networking programming services. And so that would be the amount that would be represented in an RFP describing the need for us to contract for those services. Similarly, we would be issuing a RFP for $25,000 for business training programming, which is analogous to what SCORE is currently providing to the city. So there will be generic RFPs requesting those services that we think are strategically important to economic development, and those are the proposed amounts for them.
So when you issue the RFP for $50,000, it could go to several groups or just one group?
It could be, absolutely. It could go to several groups. In that case, we would want to have a lead group. So we don't want to bifurcate and manage multiple contracts. So if a coalition of groups wants to come together, I'd like to see one sort of be the general contractor of that, and then they could sub out other components.
Okay, so one of the I may have brought this up with you before about when the city was actually managing BizMix, and that was that, and I mentioned this to the Director of Chamber of Commerce as well, of which I'm a member, and that is that we try to engage businesses on the south side, Airport Road, and be more inclusive, because what I was seeing was more of the businesses were more located downtown, and if that group is successful at bidding on on the RFP and getting a piece of the action, I think the city should, be sure that who, not only that one, but whatever else, that it's a service or a group that considers all Santa Fe, and especially the burgeoning businesses on Airport Road and thereabouts. So
Thank
I was
you.
just not seeing very much inclusive.
Thank you, and I agree, and that's our intention, certainly.
And then I wanted to ask about your position count. So what I see here is the recommended position count for exempts goes up by 1. Where would you use an exempt position? And who are those two, who are the 2 exempt? I know you are one.
I am one of the exempt positions, and then Liz Camacho, who's currently the Economic Development and Communication Administrator, is an exempt position. And then we have an open position that we haven't filled yet, which is currently called Economic Development Specialist, which we're in the process of reorganizing to have that position will be Economic Development Manager, and we are renaming the position that Liz has as manager. Both of those will be exempt. So there would be myself, the director position, and the 2 manager positions would be exempt positions.
And so would they be exempt because they're, political appointees, and because why?
I'd have to defer to Bernadette Salazar, our Director of HR, so I've been working with her on this. I'd be happy to get that information from her and provide it back to you.
Okay.
I've been working with her on this.
Well, anyway, I'm very curious about the exempt status. And then you're going, or position recommended count is to go from 3 to 6. So what would those 3 extra 3 positions be doing?
You explain that. You're moving positions over from, we went over that with.
Right. If we may.
Be clear. I wasn't sure.
Yeah, if we may, the positions we already have are 5 plus a shared. So there's myself, Liz, Rich Brown, Fabian Trujillo, and the open position. And then we have a shared position of office manager with Jessica Sandoval. So those are already in place. The additional positions are the 2 for asset development, the telecom, and then the movement of
business license.
Of Vince from business licensing and finance into economic development. So it's just moving those folks.
We're moving people. We're not creating.
Correct. Other than right. We're reclassifying too, but there's no aggregate addition of positions. We're just reclassifying from some that had been, my understanding, had been open for at least 2 years. That's how those are being reclassified for the telecom position and for the asset development associate.
So the shared position would be a half position, and it would show somewhere else in a half? Or what do you mean shared position?
My understanding is that it shows up, Jessica's position shows up underneath economic development. So on the org chart and in Kronos and the rest, it shows up full-time for economic development. However, she's actually a shared resource with affordable housing. So Jessica provides office management services to affordable housing. Alex Ladd's department and mine are adjacent to each other, so we're in absolute physical proximity. And so Jessica helps with both of us, but on the org chart, she shows up full-time.
So economic development is funding a full-time position, and half of it is being used by affordable housing.
Roughly, I think that's correct.
Okay.
On that point, just so I can understand the numbers, you explained who was exempt, but the six now recommended for classified is 2 asset development, 1 telecom, a business license person that was moved over, the shared office management, and then Rich Brown? Okay, that's 6.
Do you want the total to 10? Do you want me to go?
I guess I was just, I mean, you explained it.
Go
You
ahead.
said Matt,
Go
Liz,
ahead.
open position. The classified was the ones I just listed. And then the term is the term position?
I don't know. I don't. Do you know, Brad, who's designated as term?
Oh, that's
Maybe it's Fabian.
Yeah. Okay.
But we'll double check for you. Yeah. We'll get total clarification. We'll put names against like the designations, so it's just absolutely clear. Let's do them all, so there's no ambiguity.
Okay, any other questions? Councilor Harris.
Yeah, real quickly, it's probably a relatively new development. I don't see any listing for asset development under goals. And so as soon as possible, and I realize Mr. Kellogg is maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, a week old.
Yeah, it was this Monday or last Monday when he started, but I know he's new to the city. But I would look forward as soon as possible to really start to kind of see what a strategy would be for really getting a handle on our asset development, just kind of outlining the steps. And I'm sure you're thinking about that already, Mr. Kellogg, I have to believe.
Appreciate that. We'll have something to you before this goes formally before the governing body gets to you.
Before what goes in front of the governing? The full budget?
Yeah. So we'll get something in the next week or two.
Okay, good.
And on that point, that includes land, right?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
That's a lot of
assets.
land.
Yeah, that's right. And, and again, just the strategy, I think, is about where what you can deliver in the next week or so. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One other question I had was about the opportunity zones goal.
Mm-hmm.
And part of it is just because it's a new project nationwide and being on the anti-displacement network, there's been some pros and cons to how the program is developing nationwide. So I'm just curious, who's going to be in charge of that, and what does it mean, data visualization tool for op zones, and what are kind of the other goals to that end?
Thank you for that. So Rich Brown has been our lead on that, and I encourage you, if anyone wants to have a deep dive into this, please reach out to Rich. He's done a spectacular job of corralling all the information. He's met with all of the different stakeholders. I see Councilor Vihil Koppler nodding her head. So real estate, developers, finance, all kinds of different people. And the feds continue to issue regulations. Some just came out last week. So we continue to update our knowledge. And, excuse me, the visualization tool is one specifically we need, not just for this, but for a lot of marketing and communications, is the ability for us to show our information, for example, all of the assets that we have that we might want to attract developers to do housing, affordable housing, or attract developers to do mixed-use development in an opportunity zone. So our tool set for that is very weak. It's our website. It's completely inadequate. And particularly when you're looking from our end, we have to look at other cities that we are competing with to get this money, because it's a national program. So we really need a top-flight best practice tool to be able to communicate what's available and use that as recruiting and marketing to try to pull the dollars in to invest into our opportunity zones. So that's what that tool will enable us to do.
So how many opportunity zones did we identify?
We secured 5 in the city, and I'll tout our performance on that. There were only 7 that were available in the city at all, and then there were numerous in the county. Between the county and the city, only 5 were designated, and all were in the city.
And was one of the criteria related to income levels or
Yes.
disinvestment historically?
The criteria was not our criteria. It's actually criteria at the federal level around distressed census tracts.
Mm.
So it's all kinds of things. So it's disinvestment, it's poverty levels, it's income levels. There's all kinds of different criteria. And so we applied for all 7 that we had here. So we tried to get all 7 of them, and we were fortunate to get 5 ultimately approved by the governor.
What's the timeline for that? I know there's pieces, I'm not sure what they mean, but I can talk to Rich about it later, about just these tools and then performance overlays. What's the timeline that we have to provide? Like, what is the outcome, I guess?
As I walked in here, I just heard from Rich that the tool, it's called My Sidewalks for the visualization, it's in purchasing, so we're any moment going to get that. And then the overlay is actually a piece of work to be done between finance, land use, asset development, economic development, where what we're looking at is in those census tracts, are there policy changes? Are there ordinance changes? Are there reclassification of like R1 to C2? Are there things that we could do that would be more attractive to the investment? So if we want to see more affordable housing come up, or we want to see some innovation going into an area. So that piece of work is an internal piece of work for us that Rich and Carol and others have already started working on.
So then how does that fit into like a community engagement piece? Like actually interacting and communicating with those areas in the community and actually having them be part of a process for the opportunity zones, or we just study them and then we tell what the data shows and then it goes into some kind of federal database, and then I guess I just don't understand it, but what I read, it just seems like they keep changing the rules, like you said. So
right, we collectively, including the community, have no influence over what the feds do on the policies and regulations that are coming out. We just don't have any. So right now what we do is we get those regulations as soon as they come out. We read them, we figure out what they're telling us, and then we respond accordingly. So if that means, I think the last set that just came out was really around investment in companies rather than like investment in real estate. So we take that, synthesize it, and then go back out into, for example, in the case of the investor community, and go, new regulations have come out, and this is what they're saying about what you can do. So we keep going back to the potential stakeholders who would be interested in deploying their money once we know what the regulations are. And my understanding from Rich is nothing yet has actually been invested because the final of all the regulations haven't been issued by the feds. Perhaps another sort of inside or a part of your question is there a role for community engagement to help community members figure out if they could participate or
how they benefit is really what I
Yeah.
guess what I'm getting at. I just see the disconnect with federal government programs and how they don't always connect with community needs.
I think that'd be a great question
I'll
to
ask
bring along
Rich.
with Rich and see what else we're
Okay.
doing. Because definitely it's all of this is about investing into distressed communities. And I understand the risks involved because lots of people have been talking about that you could just come in, do, gigantic, swipe stuff clean, do a big housing, single family homes and walk away and just try to turn that property over in a 10-year period. And essentially it'll be like a massive displacement piece of work.
Right.
That's certainly not our intention or strategy. At the same time, we're limited, right? We don't have the funds. We're not making those investments. This is private investment. So we're trying to do our very best to bring our community together, right? Talk about the values, talk about the aspirations and the needs, and really motivate them to do, high quality investments that support the entire community and not try to come in and do, a displacement, which in the case at least of if they want to do that on city property, they'd have to come here, right? And Same thing, if they have to get permitting, they have to go through land use. So there's still some ways for the governing body even to have some influence over what ultimately happens in the funds.
Thank you. I'll be in touch with Rich to understand better. Thanks.
Okay, what is the pleasure of the committee?
Move to approve?
A motion and a second. Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, motion carries. Okay, Ms. McCoy, I believe you have, you're going to pass out a revised capital list.
Mr. Chairman, yes, that is correct. In addition to the revised capital list, we also have follow-up that has been requested by counselors. The second round of this follow-up, and staff continues to work diligently, and we'll have additional follow-up to your questions tomorrow and then again on Monday.
Okay, and then for the committee, I noticed the agenda for tomorrow starts with capital and then goes back into departments. Do we want to finish up with the departments and then do the capital? Because that's going to probably be a much longer discussion, and if we need to, we could run into Monday, but it'd be nice if we could complete the departments by tomorrow. Okay, so that'll be the change we'll make when we approve the agenda tomorrow. Okay, so with that, we are adjourned. Thank you.